Somewhere in the Amazon basin, beneath a canopy so thick it filters sunlight into something almost underwater, there may be the ruins of a city that has been consuming explorers for 500 years. Not metaphorically, literally consuming them. People went in looking for it and simply never came back. No bodies, no final notes, no explanation. Just the jungle, growing quietly over whatever happened next. That's where we're going tonight. And like most good mysteries, the deeper you look, the stranger it gets. If you're using this to drift off, that's exactly what it's here for. So maybe subscribe, and while you're at it, drop a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is. I genuinely read them. It's always this beautiful scatter of people. Someone in a rainy flat in Edinburgh, someone in a parked car in Sao Paulo, someone lying awake in Auckland at 2 a.m. Tell me where you are. I'll look for you now. Back to the jungle. The lost city has gone by different names across different centuries. Manoa, El Dorado, the City of Z. Each name belongs to a slightly different era of obsession, a slightly different flavour of longing. But underneath all of them is the same persistent idea, that somewhere in the interior of South America, hidden by rivers and rainforest and sheer impenetrable distance, there exists or once existed a place of extraordinary size and wealth. A civilization so advanced it shouldn't, by conventional history, exist at all. What's remarkable isn't just the legend, it's the pattern. Because again and again, across 5 centuries, the story repeats itself in almost exactly the same way. Someone hears a rumour. The rumour leads to a map or a manuscript or an old indigenous account passed through too many translations. That source leads to an expedition. The expedition goes into the jungle, and then one of 2 things happens. Either the explorers return empty-handed, broken, half-dead, insisting they found nothing but also unable to fully let go of the idea, or they don't return at all. That pattern is what makes this more than just a treasure story. It's a story about what happens to human beings when they become convinced that something extraordinary is just a little further ahead. It's about the way a powerful enough idea can override the very instincts that keep people alive. But here's the question that sits at the centre of all of it, and it's one that serious researchers are still arguing about today. Was there ever a real place behind the legend? Did some genuine city, some actual civilization, exist in the Amazon before European contact and then vanish, leaving behind only whispers and the faint impression of its outline in the landscape? Or did the jungle itself manufacture the myth, turning the incomprehensible scale and strangeness of the rainforest into stories that then took on a life entirely their own? The answer, it turns out, might be both. And that's what makes the history so layered and so worth following slowly, especially at night, when the mind is soft and the details have room to settle. Over the next while, we'll trace the whole strange arc of it, the early rumours that started crossing the Atlantic in the 1500s, the maps that invented geography with complete confidence, the expeditions that should never have been attempted, the man who disappeared into the Amazon in 1925 and became, somehow, more famous for being lost than he ever was for anything else, and what archaeology is quietly beginning to find beneath all those centuries of searching. The city refused to be found, but it never quite stopped being looked for, and that in itself is a kind of story. The first accounts didn't come from explorers. They came from people who had survived them. When Spanish conquistadors moved through the northern coast of South America in the early 1500s, they were questioning everyone they encountered about what lay inland. And indigenous people, for reasons that range from genuine helpfulness to deliberate misdirection to simple miscommunication, told them things. The problem is that almost nothing travelled across that linguistic and cultural gap without being transformed in the process. A translator would hear a word and reach for the nearest equivalent. A story about a powerful regional chief became a story about a king. A description of a ceremonial gathering place became a palace. A seasonal trade festival where people arrived bearing goods from hundreds of miles in every direction, carrying pigments and feathers and worked metals, became something that sounded to European ears very much like a golden city. None of the people doing the translating were lying necessarily. They were just working with the tools they had, and the tools were inadequate for what was being described. Here's something worth sitting with. In the Amazon basin and the surrounding regions, the word we might translate as city didn't mean what Europeans meant by it. It didn't require stone walls or a permanent population or a cathedral at its centre. It could mean a place where people gathered seasonally for trade or ritual or both. It could mean a ceremonial centre that was largely empty for most of the year, but was, during certain weeks, the most important place in a region the size of France. It could mean a hub in a trade network so extensive that goods from the Pacific coast were showing up in communities near the Atlantic. All of those things were real. All of them existed. But filtered through colonial expectations and translated into Spanish, they came out sounding like something else entirely. And then the reports began circulating, and each retelling added a little more gold. This is how legends actually form, not from nothing, but from something real that gets slightly exaggerated each time it passes through a new set of hands. One account mentioned large quantities of worked gold among a Highland people. The next account said the buildings were covered in gold. The one after that said the streets were paved with it. By the time these stories reached Europe, they were describing something that bore almost no resemblance to the original observation, but carried an emotional weight that was almost impossible to resist. What makes this especially interesting is that multiple real places were almost certainly feeding into a single story. There were advanced chiefdoms in the Llanos de Mojos. There were sophisticated cultures along the upper Xingu. There were trade networks, earthworks, managed landscapes that suggested populations far larger than anyone had assumed possible in a rainforest. These were all separate things, in separate places, operating on separate timescales. But in the oral tradition of early colonial South America, where rumour moved faster than any expedition ever could, they began to blur together. Different rivers, different peoples, different centuries of human achievement, slowly condensing into one imagined location, one city, gleaming and just out of reach. The legend wasn't invented, it was assembled, and that made it stranger and more durable than anything a single person could have made up. And then someone drew a picture. That's how a rumour becomes a fact, not when enough people repeat it, but when someone puts it on a map. Because a map carries a particular kind of authority that spoken testimony never quite achieves. It looks like evidence. It looks like knowledge that has been measured and confirmed. And in the 16th and 17th centuries, when most Europeans had no way of verifying anything that came back from the interior of South America, a cartographer's confident line was as good as a sworn statement. European map makers of this period were working under pressures that had almost nothing to do with accuracy. They were working under the pressure of patronage. Wealthy merchants, ambitious nobles, royal courts, these were the people commissioning maps, paying for them, displaying them in halls where other powerful people could see them. And what patrons wanted was not a map full of blank spaces and cautious question marks. What they wanted was a map that looked like knowledge, a map that suggested the world was known, comprehensible, and full of places worth going. So the cartographers filled in the blanks. Not randomly, not purely from imagination, but from the best available sources, which meant travellers' accounts, which meant translated indigenous testimony, which meant the same chain of misunderstandings and transformations we've already been following. A navigator mentioned that indigenous people spoke of a great lake somewhere to the south. A trader said he'd heard of a city on its banks. A priest in his letters described a region of unusual wealth, without specifying where exactly he'd gotten that impression. The cartographer took all of this, weighed it against what neighbouring maps showed, and made a decision. He drew the lake, he labelled the city, and once it was on one map, it appeared on the next, and the one after that. This is something that deserves a moment of attention, because it tells you something important about how knowledge actually works, even now. Once a feature appears on a map produced by a respected source, other cartographers are reluctant to remove it. Removing it implies that the previous cartographer was wrong, which implies that the current cartographer knows better, which requires justification. It's easier and professionally safer to include the feature with a slightly different label or a slightly adjusted position. The error propagates not because people are careless, but because the incentive structure of the profession rewards confident detail over honest uncertainty. In the Amazon basin and the Guyana highlands, this process produced some remarkably persistent geographical inventions. The most significant was Lago Parima, an enormous inland lake that appeared on European maps of northern South America for roughly 2 centuries. Its size shifted depending on the source, its exact position wandered, but it kept appearing, labelled with confidence, because it served a narrative function. The city called Manoa, the city that would eventually be called El Dorado, was almost always placed on its shores. The lake gave the city a logical reason to exist. Cities needed water, they needed trade routes. A great lake in the interior would explain everything. So the lake stayed on the maps long after anyone should have been skeptical, because removing it would have meant removing the city, and removing the city would have meant admitting that the expeditions had been chasing something that might not be there. A single mislabeled river could redirect history, and this happened more than once. Rivers in the Amazon system are genuinely confusing. They share tributaries, they change course, they flood entire regions for months at a time, turning what was solid ground into something that looks from the surface like a vast, slow-moving lake. Indigenous people navigating this system had precise knowledge of it, but that knowledge was local, seasonal, earned over generations of living there. When a European explorer asked which way a river flowed, he was asking someone whose answer depended on time of year, on which channel they meant, on distinctions the explorer didn't have the vocabulary to follow. The result was that rivers got misidentified, misconnected, mapped as going in directions they didn't go. An expedition following a map that had a single river junction wrong could spend months travelling deeper into a region while believing they were approaching their destination. What makes this particularly interesting is that the mapmakers weren't being dishonest. At least not most of them. They genuinely believed they were synthesizing the best available information into something useful. The problem was that the information itself was fractured, and the synthesis required guesses that nobody labelled as guesses. Uncertainty got laundered into confidence somewhere in the production process, and by the time the map reached an explorer planning an expedition, the guesses had become facts. There was also something almost sociological happening with the maps that carried more famous names. A city that appeared on a map produced by a prestigious cartographer, printed in Amsterdam or London or Lisbon, carried a weight that a verbal account from a jungle trader simply did not. Patrons would fund expeditions based on what the maps showed. Explorers would stake their reputations on finding what the maps promised. The map created a kind of collective investment in the reality of what it depicted. To return and say the city wasn't there was to say the map was wrong, which was to say the patrons' money was wasted, which was a conversation very few explorers were eager to have. So some of them said they'd gotten close. Some said they'd found evidence. Some said they simply needed more time, more men, more supplies. And the map got updated with their new notes. The city moved a little further inland. The lake grew slightly larger. The blank space that had once been honest became a little more filled in, a little more specific, a little more convincing. The legend was hardening. Not into truth, but into something almost more powerful, into official certainty. El Dorado did not begin as a place. Originally it was a person, or more precisely a ritual title. Spanish chroniclers along the northern Andes heard about a leader who during a ceremony would be covered in powdered gold, like a second skin of sunlight, and then washed in a sacred lake. The man of gold, El Hombre Dorado. Shortened, as words tend to be, to El Dorado. To the people performing the ritual, this wasn't about wealth in the European sense. Gold was not currency. It was not a pile of coins to be counted. It was a sacred material, a way to fix sunlight into solid form, to make offerings that would be noticed by gods and ancestors. The value was symbolic, spiritual, relational. You used gold to communicate with the unseen world, not to buy more horses. But when this story crossed the language barrier, it changed shape. Spanish listeners heard, a ruler so rich that he can pour away mountains of gold dust just to bathe in it. A lake whose bottom is carpeted with precious metal. A kingdom that treats what Europe considers ultimate wealth as disposable decoration. The ritual title became, in their minds, the name of a king. Then, almost automatically, the king acquired a kingdom. A golden king requires a golden realm. So El Dorado stretched. From a man to his court, from his court to his city, from the city to the entire region that supposedly supplied such prodigious quantities of gold. Within a few decades of first contact, the word could mean all of these things at once, depending on who was telling the story and what they wanted to get funded. That flexibility was part of its power. If one rumoured city failed to materialise, the argument could shift. Ah, you misunderstood. El Dorado is not here. It is further inland. Not this city, that one, not this kingdom, another, richer still. The gold could retreat without ever quite vanishing. Behind all of this was Europe, and Europe at this moment was hungry. The Spanish crown had already extracted staggering quantities of silver from Potosi and Mexico. Gold from the Caribbean and the mainland had flowed into royal treasuries, and from there into the veins of European commerce. But the appetite that metal created was not sated by success. It was sharpened by it. Once one empire had stumbled onto unimaginable wealth overseas, others could not afford to sit politely at home and applaud. El Dorado as an idea was perfectly tuned to this environment. It promised not just riches but competitive advantage. A city of gold inland from the northern coast of South America meant control of new trade routes, new sources of precious metal, new leverage against rival powers. Imagine you are a minor noble in Spain or England or the Low Countries with more ambition than land. Your options for rapid advancement within European society are limited. War, marriage, or something that looks like a miracle. A lost city of gold is the kind of miracle that can be pursued. It can be sailed toward. It can be written into proposals and petitions, argued for in councils and whispered about in taverns. El Dorado became a career path. This is where the notion of an inland empire began to take shape. Once maps had drawn that vast inland lake, Lago Parima, once rumours had congealed around a city called Manoa, sitting comfortably on its shore, the picture became seductively coherent, not just a solitary city in the jungle, but a whole organised realm in the interior, ringed by mountains and waterways, rich enough to rival the Aztec or Inca domains the Spanish had already encountered. To Europeans used to thinking of great wealth as the product of organised states, palaces, roads, tribute systems, the existence of such a polity did not seem wildly implausible. They had already seen that complex empires could exist in landscapes they had previously dismissed as barbarous. Why not one more, hidden further inland? There were also patterns they thought they recognized. Gold did not simply appear at a single point, it moved. From riverbeds to workshops, from workshops to markets, from markets to centres of power. If traders on the coast displayed gold ornaments of a type they did not themselves produce, it suggested some interior source. If different coastal groups all had access to similar styles, it suggested networks behind them. In this sense, there was a core of truth. The northern interior of South America was not an empty green void. It was a mosaic of societies, languages, and trade routes, stretching across rivers and savannas and mountains. Metal objects, rare stones, feathers, ceramics, salt, and foodstuffs moved along these routes in intricate patterns that had taken centuries to develop. Gold, where it was available, entered into these systems. It was mined, whether in small community operations or more organised forms. It was worked into ornaments and ritual pieces. It changed hands as gifts, as dowries, as ceremonial offerings. To an outsider arriving at the edge of this web, it could feel like standing at the shoreline of a much larger sea. Traders arriving from the interior might mention other groups further upriver, places where gold was more common, where the chiefs were richer, where certain objects originated. Each statement was probably accurate in its local context. Taken together, stripped of nuance, they could be reassembled into a picture of a single immense inland power. A Spanish officer hears that the people he's speaking with obtain their gold from neighbours 2 weeks' travel away. Those neighbours, when questioned, say that they in turn get some of their gold from yet another group even further inland, near a great body of water. Somewhere along this chain, an interpreter substitutes kingdom for group, city for settlement, lake for seasonally flooded plain. The officer returns to the coast with news. There is a powerful kingdom far inside the continent, near a vast lake, with more gold than the people on the margins can count. Is he lying? Not necessarily. He's compressing. These partial truths and compressed stories did most of the real work. They provided just enough evidence to keep skepticism at bay. Yes, the last expedition failed. But look, here is a new report of gold further upriver. Here is a new map confirming a great lake. Here is a captured object in an unfamiliar style, clearly not made on the coast, suggesting a higher level of craftsmanship somewhere inland. Patterns like this are hard for human brains to ignore. We are wired to connect dots, to prefer coherent stories over scattered data. When every new account, despite its inconsistencies, pointed vaguely in the same direction, south and east, away from the coast, toward the tangled heart of the continent, the idea of an inland empire stopped feeling like speculation and started feeling like deduction. And once you accept the empire, El Dorado becomes almost inevitable. A great empire must have a capital must have a ruler of such a realm, in a region where gold is known and ritually important, might very well perform ceremonies that involve covering himself in gold dust. The loop closes. Ritual feeds into region. Region justifies city. City demands ritual. From the outside, it can look like pure fantasy. From the inside, it is a chain of reasoning in which every link seems reasonable enough. It is also a chain that binds real bodies. Because as the legend grew more elaborate, it also grew more actionable. You could put your finger on a map and say, here, just beyond this river system, beyond these highlands. You could show your patron the way one set of gold artifacts resembles another found far to the east. You could quote a missionary's letter about great populations in the hinterland. You could argue that to leave such a realm uncontacted, unconverted, and, most importantly, unclaimed, would be a dereliction of imperial duty. For European crowns locked in rivalry, this was an argument with teeth. If Spain did not push into the interior, perhaps Portugal would. If Portugal hesitated, perhaps an English adventurer might steal a march and plant his flag on the shore of that hypothetical lake. The fear of someone else getting there first was as potent a motivator as greed for the gold itself. So expeditions were assembled, often in haste, often with resources that were barely adequate even on paper. Soldiers of fortune signed on in hopes of plunder and promotion. Convicted men were offered pardons in exchange for service. Indigenous allies were coerced or persuaded to guide routes they knew only in pieces, across territories where their own enemies lived. They marched into regions no one in Europe had seen, following rumours that had been translated 3 times and drawn once. Each failure could be explained away. The jungle was too thick. The guides were untrustworthy. The maps were wrong in detail, but not in essence. The city must lie just beyond the last reached point. The promise of El Dorado functioned like a mirage, always shimmering just beyond the horizon, always receding as you approach. But unlike a mirage, it left wreckage behind. Human beings carried this shimmering idea into landscapes that did not particularly care whether they lived or died. The cost of those decisions would be counted in lives, of conquerors, and of the people they encountered. But at this stage in the story, on the decks of ships in European harbours, in council chambers and at court, the cost was abstract, distant. What was vividly real was the dream, a hidden inland empire, a city of gold waiting patiently somewhere beyond the mapped lines, ready to transform the fortunes of whoever reached it first. And among those who found this dream irresistible was a particular English courtier who would give the city a new, more definite name and push its legend even deeper into the jungle. Sir Walter Raleigh liked to present himself as the kind of man who made miracles happen. He was not just an explorer. He was a courtier, a poet, a soldier, a schemer, whose fortunes rose and fell with the moods of Queen Elizabeth. He knew, intimately, how much of success at court depended not on what you had actually done, but on the stories you could tell about it. When Raleigh turned his attention to Guyana on the northern shoulder of South America, he approached it with this same understanding. He was not only going to sail and explore, he was going to write. In 1595 he led his first major expedition to what he would call the Empire of Guyana. The practical goals were mixed: harass the Spanish, sniff out possible trade opportunities, look for convenient river routes into the continent. But threaded through all of these was a more alluring hope, that this would be the path to the inland empire people were already whispering about, the one with the Great Lake, the one with the Golden City. When Raleigh came back, he did what he was best at. He staged his experience. He produced a book with a long, confident title, The Discovery of the Large, Rich and Beautiful Empire of Guyana. In it, he did something very clever. He did not claim, not outright, to have found El Dorado. Instead, he placed himself just at the threshold, the man who had proven that the fabled empire was real and within reach. He wrote about rivers as great as any that fall into the ocean, about fertile lands with more gold than any part of Peru. He described people wearing golden ornaments, stories of mines in the interior, reports of incredible wealth upriver. All of these things had kernels of truth in them. There was gold in Guyana. There were rich floodplains. There were complex societies in the interior. But Raleigh's genius and his danger lay in how he connected those kernels. He took scattered reports from indigenous informants about powerful chiefs inland, about lakes and flooded savannas, about places where gold was more common, and he wove them into a single shimmering narrative. A realm, an empire, a capital. He called the city Manoa. On the page, Manoa is less a detailed description and more a gravitational centre. Raleigh says it sits by a great lake the natives call Perim. He notes that the surrounding country yields gold in abundance, that the people are civil and well-governed, that their ruler commands a large and populous domain. He had not seen this city. What he had seen were rivers choked with forest, villages whose inhabitants had every reason to be cautious or misleading, landscapes where seasonal flooding could turn open plains into sheets of water for months at a time. He had heard rumours. He had captured and questioned Spaniards who themselves were repeating local stories filtered through years of fear and hope. But under the pressure he was facing, rumours were not enough. By the 1590s, Raleigh's position at the English court was precarious. He had fallen out of favour, in part because of a secret marriage that angered the Queen, in part because of court rivalries, in part because of the normal churn of fortunes in a system where proximity to the monarch was power. He needed a win, not a small one, a spectacular one. Spain, England's great rival, was still feeding on the wealth of the Americas. That wealth bought armies, navies, and influence. For an English courtier with a taste for grand gestures, the idea of an English-controlled Guyana, rich in gold and strategically placed, was irresistible. It offered a way to hurt Spain and enrich England in a single move. It also offered Raleigh, personally, a path back into the inner circle. So when he wrote his discovery, he did it with multiple audiences in mind. He was speaking to the Queen and her advisers, promising them an empire that could rival Spain's. He was speaking to potential investors and companions, men who might fund or join a second, larger expedition. And he was speaking to a wider European readership, composing a narrative that would lodge itself in the shared imagination of his time. This is where propaganda and exploration blur into each other. Raleigh needed Guyana to be more than an interesting landscape with scattered gold deposits. He needed it to be a coherent prize, a large, rich, beautiful empire with a capital city whose capture or alliance could flip the balance of power. That is what made it worth royal attention. That is what made it worth risking ships and lives. So he heightened, he emphasized, he interpreted. When an informant spoke of a great water in the interior that became Lake Perim, vast and brimming. When a story mentioned many villages around that water, Raleigh saw and then described an organized state. When people spoke of a powerful leader whose influence extended along the river networks, he upgraded this figure into a kind of emperor, ruler of all Guyana, seated at Manoa. He filled in what maps of the time had only suggested with sketchy ink, a huge inland lake, ringed by mountains with a glorious city on its shore. He treated earlier Spanish rumours, many of them second-hand, as supporting testimony. He cited named individuals, missionaries, officials, captured enemies, to give his narrative the weight of corroboration. The effect on readers was profound. Most of them, of course, had never seen Guyana and never would. Their mental picture of the region was assembled almost entirely from words and lines on paper. Raleigh's prose, confident and detailed in just the right places, supplied the scaffolding their imaginations needed. When he described rivers leading directly toward the great lake of Perim, People could trace them with their fingers on the latest printed maps. When he said that the city of Manoa was as great as any in Peru, they could slot it into a familiar framework, a New World cousin to Mexico City or Cusco, with palaces, temples, and glittering plazas. When he assured them that the gold of Guyana lay almost untouched, waiting only for a bold nation to claim it, he was speaking to their sense of both greed and competition. What Raleigh likely saw on his journey was a complex, humid, difficult landscape, swollen rivers where the current, not a road, dictated your path, marginal notes of agriculture along the banks, gardens and clearings that hinted at intricate knowledge of soils and flood cycles, hints of long-distance trade, beads from elsewhere, metal in designs not made locally, words borrowed from distant languages. He would have heard the names of many groups, each with their own interests and enemies. He would have been negotiating in a chain of half-translations and guesses, often with people who had every incentive to send him toward their rivals and away from themselves. He likely heard about lakes that were not lakes in the European sense, but seasonal inundations, broad savannas that turned to water for months then back to grass. About chiefs who were powerful in their region, but not emperors in the Aztec or Inca style. About gold that was important ritually, not piled in vaults. His readers, however, did not see any of that complexity. They saw the synthesis. The difference between what Raleigh saw and what Europe imagined is like the difference between standing in a dense forest and looking at it on a map. In the forest, your view is always partial. You see trunks and undergrowth, maybe a glimpse of sky. On the map, you see a clean outline. Here is the forest, here is the lake, here is the city. Manoa, as Raleigh presented it, was a map object, sharp-edged, definite, anchoring. Once he named it and placed it on Lake Perim, later writers had something solid to refer to. They could debate its exact location, adjust it a few degrees north or south, but the basic picture had hardened. Inland empire, Great Lake, capital city. From that point on, Manoa was not simply one rumour among many. It was the rumour that other stories were forced to orbit. Spanish, Dutch, and later French writers picked up Raleigh's account, quoted it, argued with it, embellished it. Some criticised him, calling him a liar or an exaggerator. Others defended him, pointing to new bits of information from travellers that seemed to confirm one detail or another. But even the critics were working within the frame he had set. Maps followed suit. For more than a century, many European maps of South America showed a large inland lake in roughly the place Raleigh's book implied, with a city, Manoa, sometimes labelled as El Dorado itself, drawn on its shore. The reality on the ground, where flooded savannas and river systems shifted with the seasons, did not match this simple picture. But the picture persisted. It was just too satisfying. And that picture did things. It gave direction to energy that might otherwise have scattered. If you were a later seeker, a Spanish officer wanting to rehabilitate a failed career, a Dutch merchant looking for a foothold, a Portuguese colonist dreaming of sidestepping Spanish power, you now had a destination you could write into your proposals. You did not have to say, I will wander vaguely inland and see what I find. You could say, I will go in search of the city of Manoa, on the shores of Lake Perim, as described by Sir Walter Raleigh. That sounded like a plan, even when it wasn't. Raleigh himself would never reach Manoa. His later attempt to return to Guyana ended in disaster and contributed to his downfall, but his story, printed and reprinted, translated and summarized, kept travelling. Every time a new expedition went up one of those brown rivers, inched along through flooded forests or hacked its way over dripping ridges, it was partly walking in the tracks of Raleigh's words. His blend of observation and ambition, of genuine curiosity and political calculation, had turned a loose cluster of interior rumours into a fixed point of longing on the mental map of Europe. From then on, the lost city had a name, a lake, and a supposed location. It had a literary pedigree and cartographic coordinates. It was no longer just El Dorado in the abstract, the man of gold turned kingdom. It was Manoa of Lake Perim, and with that the legend became easier to chase, and much harder to let go. If you were one of the men who believed Raleigh, sooner or later you would discover that between you and his empire of Guyana stood something far more implacable than Spain. The forest. On a map, the route toward Manoa looked almost orderly. A riverline here, a tributary there, a dotted path nudging inland toward the imagined lake. Distances were measured by degrees of latitude, marching neatly up the page. In conversation, it sounded simple enough. You go upriver. On the ground, upriver stopped being a direction and became an ordeal. The rivers themselves were not fixed roads. In that part of South America, water is always renegotiating the landscape. During the rains, the main channels swell and burst their banks, pushing sideways into the forest. Where a European might expect a clear separation between river and land, the Amazonian lowlands offer long bands of in-between. Flooded forests, where you move among trunks and roots in a half-drowned world. From a dugout canoe, that world feels endless. The canopy knits over your head, branches and lianas crossing from tree to tree like a woven ceiling. Light falls in thin columns, caught in haze and insect wings. There is no distant landmark, no mountain peak or church steeple to orient yourself by. Your horizon shrinks to a corridor of water and green, and the water is not still. Currents tug at you from below, some obvious, some subtle. Where rivers bend, they chew at one bank and build up the other. Over time, the bend loops tighter, like a whip curling back on itself. Eventually, the river slices through at the narrowest point, abandoning the old loop. What's left behind is a crescent-shaped scar filled with water, an oxbow lake. On paper, these look decorative, little horseshoes beside the main river. In reality, they are traps for anyone who doesn't know them intimately. You paddle into what seems like a side channel, follow it as it curves, and at some point you realize the current has softened. The water feels sluggish, heavy. You're not going anywhere now. You're in a dead-end lake shaped like a river. To a European navigator raised on coasts and harbours, this kind of inland ambiguity could be maddening. A shoreline, even a complex one, holds still from season to season. These rivers did not. They twisted, cut new channels, abandoned old ones. What had been a navigable route one year might be a tangle of fallen trees the next. A shortcut that locals had used for generations might vanish beneath sediment, while a new passage opened somewhere else. And then there were the tributaries. On the map they branched tidally, each with its own name and course. On the water, many of them looked almost exactly the same. Brown, slow or fast depending on the season. Walls of greenery on either side, driftwood, occasional sandbars, maybe a village landing if you were lucky or nothing at all. You might reach a junction where 3 channels met, each flowing with deceptive calm. The sky above each was the same narrow strip. The smell, mud, rot, sap, was the same. Unless you had someone with you who knew the local pattern of currents, the timing of floods, which channel ran clear in the dry season and which turned treacherous, you were guessing. Compasses could point north, but they could not tell you which fork led to food, which toward hostile territory, which to a maze of shallow backwaters that would strand your boats and rot your supplies. Failure of navigation here did not necessarily mean running aground on rocks. It meant drifting, circling, burning precious days and calories. It meant emerging, weeks later, somewhere completely different from where your map and your hopes had placed you, with your men thinner, your gunpowder damp, and your credibility eroding. And all the while the jungle was working on you. From a distance, European readers often imagine tropical forests as paradises of abundance. Endless fruit, teeming game, brilliant flowers. In some ways, they were right. The biodiversity was staggering, but high biodiversity does not automatically mean easy living, especially for newcomers who do not know what they are looking at. The heat sat on you like an extra layer of clothing you couldn't remove. Humidity wrapped every breath. Sweat didn't cool you. It just mixed with the air already thick with moisture. Marching or paddling in these conditions drains strength in a way that is hard to understand if you're used to dry heat or temperate summers. Men accustomed to European campaigns found themselves exhausted after a few hours, their clothes permanently damp, their boots softening, their skin breaking down. Dehydration became a strange paradox. Surrounded by water, you could still die of thirst. River water was full of sediment and microorganisms that your body had never met before. Drink freely, and you risked days of violent illness, losing more water than you took in. Boiling helped when there was time and fuel. Often speed felt more urgent than care. Parasites were everywhere, invisible and patient. Tiny worms and protozoa waiting in water and soil. Insects looking for any patch of exposed skin. Leeches that slipped into boots or up trouser legs. Mosquitoes that carried fevers. Europeans did not yet understand. A periodic shaking, a boiling of the blood, a weakness that returned in cruel cycles. Even minor cuts, scratches from thorns, nicks from machetes, could sour and swell, fed by the constant moisture and the bacterial stew of the forest floor. Infection was not a distant possibility. It was a daily presence. A blister from an ill-fitting boot might become an ulcer. A thorn embedded in a finger could lead to a hand too swollen to hold a paddle. In a setting where progress depended on every man working, where turning back meant admitting defeat, illnesses like these were not just personal misfortunes. They were logistical threats. Food, supposedly so plentiful, created its own set of problems. The staple European foods that expeditions brought with them were not designed for months in a wet, hot environment. Flour moulded. Hardtack softened and bloomed with life of its own. Salted meat grew rancid faster than expected. Barrels swelled and split. Cloth sacks rotted where they touched damp wood. The same humidity that softened skin and leather accelerated the breakdown of supplies. Expeditions tried to leave caches, stockpiles hidden along the route, meant for use on the return journey or by later parties. But in a landscape where the river might chew away another few meters of bank in a single flood season, where trees toppled unexpectedly, where animals investigated any new scent, these caches were unreliable lifelines. A carefully buried barrel might be underwater the next year. A mark cut into a tree to signal a stash might be obscured by new growth, or the entire tree might be gone. Hunting and foraging helped, but only if you knew what you were doing. Local indigenous groups had detailed knowledge, which fruits were edible and when, which fish to take in which reach of river, how to trap animals without scaring them out of a hunting territory. They knew how to process toxic roots into safe starches, how to find fat and protein in a landscape that, for all its greenness, did not necessarily offer large land animals in constant abundance. European expedition leaders, unless they listened very carefully and maintained good relations with local guides, could not count on this. They might shoot a monkey or a tapir now and then, but gunpowder was limited and dampness could ruin it. Fishing nets tore, lines snapped. A few days of bad luck or misjudgment could mean half rations, then quarter rations, then the kind of hunger that makes men reckless. And hunger, layered onto exhaustion, heat, and illness, did something to the mind. One of the things travellers often remark on in dense tropical forest is the sameness of it. The colours and details are endlessly varied, every leaf slightly different, every insect unique. But at the scale of human memory, it blurs. Each bend of the river looks like the last. The same leaning tree, the same clutch of vines, the same low bank of mud. Each makeshift campsite seems to echo the previous one. Without distant landmarks, your sense of progress becomes unmoored. You may have been paddling for 10 hours, but the sun is just a pale disk somewhere above the canopy, and the banks on either side look unchanged. You have a compass bearing perhaps, and the current under you, but subjectively it feels as if the forest is not letting you go forward, so much as swallowing your effort and giving no sign. This is how the environment begins to feel not just difficult, but actively consuming. You are moving, but there is little evidence of having been anywhere. Your footprints vanish in the next rain. Your cuts in the undergrowth are covered by new shoots within days. A campsite that felt like an intrusion looks, a week later, as if no one has ever been there. The forest closes behind you the way water smooths over after a ship passes. To men who came from landscapes marked by roads, stone walls, cultivated fields, places where human presence lingered for generations, this evanescence could be deeply unsettling. It encouraged the sense that the jungle itself was indifferent to them, overwhelming not by open hostility, but by patient, effortless erasure. If you started a journey believing that a great city awaited you inland, you might, after weeks in this maze of water and green, begin to feel the opposite, that the city, if it existed, did not want to be found, that every wrong turning on an oxbow, every spoiled barrel of food, every fevered night under mosquito nets that sagged and tore was part of a quiet resistance. Later, when news reached the coast, or Europe, that yet another expedition had gone in and not come out, people would talk about hostile tribes, or Spanish ambushes, or poor leadership, and sometimes those things were real. But beneath all of those stories ran a simpler truth. The land itself was hard. In a place where rivers rewrote their own courses, where the forest erased footprints almost as soon as they were made, where climate and biology turned small mistakes into fatal ones, it did not take a dramatic disaster to make an expedition disappear. It just took time. Step by step, paddle stroke by paddle stroke, the jungle did what it always does. It absorbed people, it wore them down, it blurred their tracks. From the outside, it looked as if the city had swallowed its seekers. From the inside, it felt as though you had entered a living maze, one that could close over you without a sound. And still, in the reports that filtered back, the rivers were described as roads to somewhere, not just into this green infinity. The maze, after all, is only frightening if there might be something at its centre. Rivers are roads that move. For Europeans used to treating water as something you cross on your way to land, this was a difficult lesson. In Guyana and the wider Amazon basin, people did not march overland if they could help it. They followed the water. Canoes were faster than feet, and in a world without beasts of burden or wheeled carts, the river was the closest thing to a highway. But it was a highway that changed lanes without warning, that sometimes decided there would be no road at all where, last year, there had been one. In the dry season, paths emerged that might tempt a later traveller into thinking the forest was finally yielding. Sandy banks appeared, exposed like pale scars along the curves of the river. Side streams shrank back into their beds, leaving firm mud flats and animal tracks. Overhead, the canopy thinned just enough to let shafts of light reach the ground. For a few months, you could walk in places that, during the rains, were a tangle of roots hidden beneath brown, waist-deep water. An expedition that passed through in these conditions might note a good campsite on a high bank, a spot where they had cut a clearing, set up tarps, buried a cache of supplies. They might scratch a symbol into a tree, or stack stones in a way that would mean something when they returned. Then the season turned. The same paths softened, darkened, and disappeared. Rains blew in, not as gentle showers, but as walls of water that fell for hours, sometimes days, until the air itself felt almost liquid. The river rose quietly at first, then with an urgency that surprised those who had never seen such cycles. The sandy bank where men had slept and argued and carved their initials went under with barely a ripple. The mark on the tree stood for a while above the floodline, then the bank itself slumped and slid away, roots and all. Where you had once walked, you now paddled. From the canoe, the world rearranged itself. Trees that had seemed anchored now stood in water. New passages opened between their trunks. Old landmarks, if you had any, were now almost level with your eyes instead of looming above you. A bend that had been a sharp turn of dry land became a gentle arc of flooded forest. The cache you had buried with such care might now be 3 meters under a slow, opaque current, or not there at all. When explorers spoke later of the jungle as if it conspired against them, some of what they meant was this seasonal sleight of hand. A route taken one way could not easily be retraced. The land itself had forgotten the shape of your journey. Still, for men in small boats, the river was hope as much as threat. On water, you could cover in a day what might take a week on foot. Paddling downstream with the current, there was the exhilarating sense of being carried, of the country unfolding around the bend without you having to fight for every step. Even going upstream, hugging the quieter eddies near the bank, you moved more steadily than you ever could by hacking through dense undergrowth. But that speed came with a particular kind of trap. Imagine you are leading such a party upriver. You have maybe 3 or 4 canoes, each carrying men, barrels, weapons, precious dry goods wrapped in oilcloth and faith. The river surface looks calm enough, but the current below is uneven. One channel hugs the outside of a bend and runs fast. Another, nearer the inside, curls back on itself, a slow whirlpool of leaf litter and drifting branches. From the stern of your own canoe, you gesture for the others to follow your line. They try. But a moment of inattention, a paddle stroke too deep or too lazy, and a boat slips sideways into the wrong vein of water. At first, it's just a few meters off your wake. Then the current takes it. The distance widens. Voices carry poorly in this world. The forest eats sound. What feels like shouting at the top of your lungs breaks into fragments among the trunks and under the canopy. The men in the separated canoe may hear something, may see your raised arm for a second as their boat swings around a partially submerged tree, but the meaning is lost. Their angle of view is different now. To them, it looks as if you are the one drifting away. You round a bend, and for a moment the channels diverge completely. On your side, the river presses against a clay bank. On theirs, it slides into what seems like another main course, wide and promising. Neither of you knows that theirs will narrow, twist, loop into a dead arm, and end in a silent lake ringed with forest. You think they are just behind you. They think you are just ahead. By the time either side realizes something is wrong, the river has already done its work. Turning around is not as simple as walking back down a road. You have to find space to swing the canoe, fight the current that was helping you a moment ago. The trees that lean over the water snag paddles and hats and tempers. After an hour of struggle, you may reach the point where you think you separated, only to find 3 new channels instead of 2. Small errors in such an environment do not stay small. On a European march, if a column drifted a little off its intended line, there were usually ways to correct. You might see a village steeple, a hill, a distinctive clump of trees that told you where you were on the map. Distances could be paced, bearings taken, adjustments made. In these river labyrinths, precision was an illusion most of the time. Distances were estimated in days' journey, a phrase that sounds reassuringly solid until you look at what goes into a day. How strong were the paddlers? How many times did you stop to haul the canoes over shallows or to cut through the obstruction of a fallen tree? Was the current helping or hindering? Was someone sick that day, slowing the whole party? Or were you racing along in a fit of optimism and clear weather? Bearings, too, played tricks. Compasses worked, in a limited way, but the river did not care about magnetic north. It twisted with the contours of the land, responding to ancient layers of sediment and bedrock, to the push of tributaries and the memory of old floodplains. You might be heading generally west, but to do that you had to paddle for hours due south along a meander, then sweep in a broad arc back toward the north. If you tried to record this faithfully, north for so many minutes, bend, then northeast, then south-southwest. You ended up with a notebook full of angles and estimates that, when translated onto a map, produced something that looked reasonable, but did not match the actual indifferent river you would meet next year. Now imagine these uncertainties compounding over weeks. You think you have climbed perhaps 200 kilometers inland. In reality, you may have gone half as far. Your path wound into loops and side channels that brought you back near your own earlier track without your ever recognizing it. Or you may have gone farther than you believe, the current giving you an unnoticed push, now placing you among people and landscapes your guides have never seen. In such a setting, communication was not just a matter of language. It was a matter of keeping bodies in the same place long enough to speak at all. Scouting ahead was both necessary and dangerous. A fast canoe carrying 2 or 3 men could slip upstream more quickly, checking for rapids, hostile landings, or promising side channels. They would agree on a rendezvous, a certain sandbank by sunset, a particular bend where a large tree with buttress roots jutted into the water. Then a sudden storm might darken the sky hours earlier than expected. Rain erased footprints, softened sandbanks into featureless slopes. That remarkable tree might topple in a gust and crash unseen into the flood, vanishing beneath the roiling surface. The main party, slowed by an accident or by the need to repair a damaged canoe, might arrive late. The scouts, waiting nervously, would face a choice as the light went: move on or risk spending the night exposed on an open bank. Sometimes they chose to push ahead, trusting they could be overtaken. Sometimes they huddled under jerky awnings and shivered, listening to night sounds and mosquitoes. In either case, the clear plan agreed upon in the morning dissolved into improvisation by evening. A similar fragility haunted any attempt to spread out. In the maze of channels and flooded groves, it was often tempting to send small groups along parallel routes in the hope of rejoining later. On a flat plain, you might see those other teams a mile to your left, moving as other lines in the same broad direction. On the river, 100 meters was enough to hide them completely. You could be separated from half your expedition by a thin veil of trees and never know it. Stories trickling back to Europe spoke often of men lost in the forest, and in popular imagination this meant individuals wandering aimlessly among trees, confused by undergrowth. The reality was more mundane and more chilling. Parties were lost to each other without ever leaving their canoes, a delayed arrival at camp, a boat that failed to appear at a junction where 3 streams met, a scout who, following what seemed like the main flow, slid silently into another drainage basin altogether, where the river was no longer the same river, where the people along its banks had never heard of your leader, your mission, or your imagined city. When survivors did find their way out, months or years later, they carried not only fewer companions but also fewer certainties. They could say that they had turned left at a great confluence, that they had spent 12 days on a Blackwater tributary, that they had crossed from one watershed into another without realizing until later. They could describe hunger and illness, and occasional moments of great kindness or sharp hostility from the people they met along the banks. But if you asked them to trace their route exactly, to draw the path from the known coast up to the rumoured city and back, their pencils hesitated. Memory blurred. The river's habit of erasing campsites, of swallowing landmarks, of changing its own course between one expedition and the next, meant that each journey was unique and, in crucial ways, unrepeatable. The effect on the legend was paradoxical. On the one hand, the lack of clear trails, the vanishing of precise routes, made it easier for skeptics to dismiss grand claims. A man who could not point with conviction to where he had turned back was an easy target for those who believed Manoa had never existed outside of wishful thinking and financial necessity. On the other hand, the same vagueness kept possibility alive. If no one could ever be entirely sure they had followed the right river, if seasonal floods could hide the one sandbank where a Golden City's emissaries had supposedly once traded, then failure did not disprove the dream. It simply meant you had somehow taken the wrong fork, come at the mystery from the wrong angle, arrived at the rendezvous a year too late. And so the rivers continued to draw people inland, promising rapid passage and, just as often, dispersing them into forgetfulness. Each expedition that returned did so a little thinner, a little quieter, stripped of men and information both. Each one left fewer clear lines on the map and more question marks, between what they thought they had seen and what they could reliably locate again. A gap opened. Into that gap flowed rumours, misunderstandings, and the fragile threads of contact with the peoples who had always lived along these waters. In that uncertain space, the story of Manoa, and of all the other cities said to hide in the green interior, began to tangle with something else. The story of the encounters between those who arrived by river and those who already knew every twist of its changing course. For the people who lived along those rivers, none of this was mysterious. The maze of channels that turned European expeditions into wandering rumours was, for them, a familiar neighbourhood. Not simple, not easy, but learned over a lifetime. The bends had stories attached to them. The creeks had names that recalled floods, battles, lovers' quarrels, successful hunts. A sandbank was not just a place to camp. It was the site where a grandfather had seen a jaguar, where a cousin had drowned, where a strange boat had once appeared from downstream bearing men with metal on their chests and fabric like water on their shoulders. Yet, in the accounts that made their way back across the ocean, all this detail flattened. The hundreds of distinct societies that lined the rivers, each with its own language, customs, histories, political rivalries, were compressed into a handful of labels. The Indians of the river, the people of the interior, a shifting mosaic reduced to a single, vague presence. Some of this came from ignorance. A party that met 3 different groups in as many weeks, each speaking a different tongue, might never realize they were distinct in any deep sense. They were wet, hungry, anxious about disease and ambush. Their questions, when they managed to ask any at all through interpreters of uncertain reliability, were blunt and practical. Food, gold, enemies, paths. In that haze, fine distinctions of identity vanished. Some of it, too, came from convenience. Back in Europe, it was easier to speak of the people of Guyana or the tribes of the Amazon than to try to explain the full variety of Carib-speaking raiders, Arawak farmers, semi-nomadic fishers, settled potters, river traders, upland hunters. Simplicity made for more persuasive petitions to investors, more stirring tales in taverns, more manageable maps. But on the rivers themselves there was nothing simple about these encounters. Imagine coming around a bend after 3 days of seeing no one, your canoes low in the water from constant bailing, your men's hands blistered, your supplies already starting to mould despite all your precautions. Smoke rises from a clearing ahead. A few canoes lie pulled up on the bank. Figures move between palm-thatched houses. For a moment, the relief at seeing other human beings almost outweighs the fear. If your interpreter speaks a closely related language, the first exchanges may feel surprisingly smooth. Greetings, explanations. You say you're from far away, across the sea. You're looking for another river, or for a lake, or for a city whose name your hosts have never heard. You point vaguely inland. You try to draw in the wet sand, a circle for the city, lines for roads or rivers. They watch, curious, amused, politely baffled. Or perhaps your interpreter does not speak their language at all. Perhaps he is from the coast, brought inland as a guide, and has never travelled this particular tributary. The words he offers are guesses, based on gestures and on similarities to sounds he does know. He may be wrong in small ways you cannot detect, confusing far with behind, people with enemies, village with direction. He may be wrong in large ways, mistaking a refusal for consent, a warning for an invitation. In this atmosphere, diplomacy becomes a careful dance performed on rotten boards. Trade is the first language most parties manage to share. Beads, metal knives, glass mirrors, bits of cloth are brought out with a certain ceremony. In return, smoked fish appears, or cassava bread, or baskets of fruit, or pots of thick, dark drink. Both sides are evaluating constantly. How desperate are these strangers? How many of them are there? What weapons do they carry? Are they likely to come back with more? Guides are often the second point of negotiation. You want someone who knows the next stretch of river, someone who can tell you which channels are dead ends and which lead toward the waters you have been told will take you to Manoa, or to some other imagined interior kingdom. Your hosts may offer a man or two, or a small canoe. They rarely do this out of pure generosity. A guide might go because he is curious, because he has been pressured by his elders, because he hopes to gain advantage over neighbouring groups by learning who these newcomers are and what they want. He might also go because he sees, in the steel at your belt and the odd glint in your eyes, that refusal would be dangerous. For the local communities, alliances were never abstract. Information flowed up and down the rivers long before Europeans arrived. News of a new group with strange tools and immense greed travelled as quickly as a canoe in flood season. Villages downstream spoke of villages upstream who had received gifts, or had been forced to surrender people as porters or captives, or had been attacked when trade went wrong. Everyone listened. Everyone adjusted. One group might decide to welcome you, hoping to divert your attention toward their enemies. Yes, they say, there is indeed a powerful people inland, rich, many ornaments, perhaps you should go that way. Another, having heard of such tactics, might deny all knowledge, insist that the river ends just ahead, that there is only forest and swamp beyond. They are not trying to thwart your dreams of discovery. They are trying to protect themselves from becoming someone else's bait. Loyalties shifted with the current. A man who paddled with your party for 3 days, laughing at your clumsiness, teaching you the names of birds, might slip away at dawn on the fourth morning, silently towing his canoe back to the bank, unwilling to be taken farther from home. A chief who had offered you food and shelter on your way up might, on your way down, refuse you landing, having heard now of violence you committed elsewhere, or of disease following in your wake. In later retellings, these complexities often hardened into simple judgments. The Indians are treacherous. They are childlike. They are natural allies against this other tribe. Each of these sentences erased more than it revealed. Language sat at the centre of many misunderstandings. When you asked for the name of a place, what answer did you receive? If you pointed to the village itself, the name you were given might indeed be the village's name, or it might be the word for home, or people, or here. If you pointed at the river, you might be told the name of that particular bend, or of the nearest fishing ground, or simply water. Over days and weeks these labels drifted. A word that originally meant those others upriver who trade with us might in your notebook become the name of a powerful kingdom. A word that meant old town, the site of a former village abandoned after a flood or a war, might become, in your imagination, a city that had once been splendid and would surely be found again if you pressed on. Place names relocated themselves on European maps like migrating birds, blown off course by each new retelling. Sometimes, when explorers later insisted they had been told about a great city beyond the mountains, what their informants may actually have said was closer to many people live that way, or there is much land there, or we have heard of people who trade with other people farther on. Under pressure, any gesture toward abundance could be converted into architecture. Fear and rumour enjoyed even fewer constraints than words. A single violent encounter could echo for years along the banks. The killing of one chief by men with metal weapons might be remembered 3 villages away as the slaughter of an entire settlement. By the time the tale reached the coast, it might have grown into an origin story. The day when the world changed, when beings from beyond the horizon appeared and could not be killed by arrows. From the other side, stories travelled as well. A fever that swept through an expedition's camp, felling men who had seemed invincible days before, might be retold in the next letter home as poisoning by treacherous savages. The refusal of a village to provide more food after months of sporadic visits might be reported as rebellion or ingratitude. Rumours of gold worked in similar ways. A few ornaments, perhaps the cherished inheritance of a family, exchanged under duress, or as a desperate peace offering, became in some accounts evidence of rivers whose sands glittered with metal, of cities where roofs shone at noon. You believed what you were prepared to believe, and in doing so you shaped what later listeners were prepared to hear. Underneath all this churn of story and misunderstanding, something much harder sits. It is one thing to speak of alliances and guides, of trade and shifting loyalties. It is another to acknowledge what these encounters often became, campaigns of extraction and domination. Men did not come inland merely to satisfy curiosity. They came under orders, with charters and patents, with promises of land and spoils, with expectations set by monarchs and creditors who would never see the rivers for themselves. Violence was not always immediate or spectacular. It did not always look like burning villages or open battles. Often it was quieter. Demands for food that stripped local stores, forced labour to carry loads or cut paths, the taking of captives as hostages for safe passage, the bringing of diseases to which no one along those banks had any defence. At the same time, resistance was neither futile nor simple. Some communities learned to play the new arrivals against one another, favouring one expedition over another, embracing temporary alliances that brought tools and weapons while trying to contain the damage. Others chose flight, melting deeper into the forest, abandoning old sites and scattering into smaller groups that were harder to coerce. None of these strategies guaranteed safety. All of them testify to agency in the face of unwanted intrusion. The legend of a lost city ran through this world like a bright, seductive thread. For outsiders it explained and justified their repeated journeys into places that did not want them. For some of the people along the rivers, It became, over time, a useful story to tell or to withhold, depending on who was asking and why. A distant Manoa could be pointed toward as a way of redirecting strangers and their violence, or it could be denied altogether in an effort to make the river less interesting, less worth following. Between genuine hospitality and strategic deception, between fear and hope, between the urgent needs of expeditions and the equally urgent needs of those who lived along the water, a tangle of relationships grew. Out of that tangle, later writers tried to pull a simple line that would lead straight to the lost city. But the line was never simple. It was frayed from the beginning, braided out of alliances that lasted a season, and misunderstandings that lasted centuries. By the time the stories settled into ink and print, many of the people who had actually spoken, guided, warned, or refused were gone. Their words survived only as echoes in other tongues, as marks on maps, as footnotes in someone else's heroic narrative. And the question of what exactly they had meant when they pointed upriver or laughed at the mention of a city no one had seen. That question sank slowly into the same brown water that had already swallowed so many campsites and carved names. What remained were testimonies, journals, depositions, campfire tales retold in calmer rooms across the sea. And in these the lost city grew brighter and sharper even as the real voices of the river faded into a murmur. Testimony sounds solid. The word suggests courts and oaths, men with steady hands signing their names. In the age of the lost city it meant something far more slippery. A tired man in a damp tent writing by the light of a smoky lamp, trying to turn weeks of confusion, hunger, fear, and fleeting triumph into a clear story. On paper, these accounts look confident. Distances are stated, directions are given, the moods and intentions of strangers are reported as if the writer had access to their inner thoughts. The river twists become straight lines. The days blur into sequences that march neatly toward a conclusion. But listen closely and you can hear the strain. Each journal had to do more than remember. It had to persuade. The man holding the pen was almost never writing only for himself. He was writing for a patron back in London or Madrid, for investors who had risked money on his voyage, for a monarch who might read only the summary, but whose favour could transform his life. He was also quite often writing for rivals, men who would gladly pounce on any admission of error or weakness. Under those eyes, the temptation to revise the past was strong. If you had turned back earlier than planned because your men were sick, your supplies low, your courage compromised by some half-glimpsed threat in the trees, you rarely wrote, "I turned back because I was afraid of dying pointlessly." You wrote instead of impassable rapids, of treacherous guides, of an unavoidable shortage of provisions. You framed your retreat as prudence rather than failure. If your crew had quarrelled, if discipline had collapsed, if a rash act of violence on your part had ruined relations with a crucial village, you might mention unfortunate clashes, or misunderstandings with the natives, never quite tracing how they began. If some of your own decisions had led directly to hunger or casualties, well, those could be blurred behind phrases like "necessity compelled us" and "circumstances beyond our control." Ego in these pages was not just vanity, it was armour. A man seeking a second expedition could not appear incompetent. A man hoping to be remembered as a bold pathfinder, rather than a costly embarrassment, could not afford to seem hesitating, confused, or easily misled. So the meanders of the river became errors in the map. The dead ends became signs that the true path had been tantalizingly close, blocked only by one unlucky turn or one uncooperative chief. You could always suggest that, with a little more funding, a few more men, better supplies, you would succeed next time, and funding mattered, a great deal. An expedition that brought back no gold, no captives, no immediate evidence of profit had to deliver something else, a promise. Discovery in this world was often a down payment on future extraction. The report you wrote after staggering out of the forest had to answer a silent question. Was this journey a waste, or did it reveal possibilities worth gambling on again? So small details began to glow in the dark. A single hammered gold ornament seen on the chest of a chief might become, in retelling, an emblem of mines hidden somewhere upstream. A few days of travelling through relatively open, cultivated land, fields of manioc, orchards of fruit trees, could be reimagined as the outskirts of a great realm. Well-peopled and rich, perhaps the very threshold of Manoa. What had felt at the time like a blur of hardship and uncertainty could, on the page, be rearranged into a sequence of clues all pointing in the same direction, onward. At the same time, other details faded or disappeared, moments of doubt, villages where people had plainly never heard of the wonders you asked about, places where your guides shrugged or laughed at your questions, days when the only remarkable feature of the landscape was its endless, oppressive sameness. These did not help make a case for renewed investment. They slipped between lines or were compressed into several days of uneventful travel. Between the raw experience and the written testimony, a filter of need was always at work. And then there is the harshest filter of all, survival. We mostly possess the accounts of those who made it back. The men whose canoes overturned in sudden storms, whose camps were taken at night by enemies or disease, whose parties staggered too far and never found their way to the main river again. These men left no neat journals for future archivists. Their notebooks, if they had them, were soaked and rotting somewhere under layers of fallen leaves, or burned in fires that consumed all trace of their names. What we know comes largely from the ones who retreated in time. In their stories, turning back is often framed as wisdom, yet we cannot easily compare their choices with those of the ones who pressed on just a bit farther, into the silence. We cannot hear from someone who reached a thriving cluster of towns along a rarely visited tributary and died there of fever, or from another who found nothing but swamp and starvation but never had the chance to tell anyone so. This is survivor bias written in ink. The official record is tilted toward paths that led safely home, which are not necessarily the most representative or the most revealing of what lay inland. A man who happened, by luck and judgment, to follow a route where communities were wary and withdrew, may conclude that the interior is thinly peopled. Another, guided along trading arteries lined with villages, may swear the opposite, that the land is rich in inhabitants and ruled by a distant, unseen power. Both are speaking truly from where they have been. Neither can speak for the whole. Over these individual memories another set of hands exerted pressure. Patrons and publishers had their own interests. A chronicler working for the Spanish crown, assembling a narrative of conquest and discovery, might smooth contradictions between sources or choose the most flattering interpretation when accounts clashed. A London printer catering to readers hungry for marvels might edit out dull passages of hardship in favour of violence, treasure, and wonders. Emphasis shifted under these touches. A cautious sentence. We were told by some that there may be a great town inland, but others denied it and we didn't see it ourselves, could be shortened in a printed version to, we were told there is a great town inland. Doubtful qualifiers slid away. Reports that said only, the people are numerous and have much cultivated land might be headlined as, a rich and populous country within the interior, the better to stir imaginations and open purses. Sometimes entire episodes vanished. An ugly quarrel with a local ally might be omitted so as not to cast doubt on the expedition's moral standing. Scenes of men stealing food from villages they had been welcomed into could be left out, replaced by more palatable phrases about provisions obtained. A deadlock or failure that might suggest the venture was a bad bet could be softened into a temporary setback. The printed testimonies that circulate through history are already curated versions of the field notes, adjusted to meet the demands of power and profit, and beneath all of this lies another layer of fragility, language itself. Almost every grand claim about a city in the interior, a kingdom of gold, a road leading to marvels, began as spoken words passing through at least one other human mind before reaching the ear of an explorer. Often through two or three. A local hunter spoke to a village elder. The elder spoke to a regional headman. The headman spoke to an interpreter who knew a coastal trade tongue. The interpreter then tried to explain, in halting Spanish or Portuguese or English, what had been said. At each step choices were made. Which details were worth mentioning? Which terms had no clear equivalent? When someone used a word for many people or a big place, did the interpreter choose city? When someone described gold as a rare ritual substance used in certain ceremonies, did that become, in translation, they have great abundance of gold? An interpreter might simplify to keep the conversation moving, or embellish to please his powerful employers, or misunderstand entirely. He might have reason to steer the foreigners toward or away from certain regions, depending on his own alliances, fears, or hopes. His testimony, embedded within the explorer's testimony, is rarely visible, but it shapes the whole. By the time such an account reached a European desk, it might be 3 or 4 translations removed from its origin. No wonder the testimonies clash. One journal insists that a certain great water lies only 10 days' journey inland, guided by people who spoke confidently of it. Another, travelling perhaps along a slightly different path a decade later, reports that the same water is unknown to everyone he meets. One writer notes friendly, prosperous villages along a stretch of river. Another describes that same region as hostile and desolate. Historians, centuries on, try to reconcile these differences with maps, climate data, and archaeology. But for the people living through it, the contradictions did something stranger. They fed the legend. Because if one trusted account denied the city and another, equally trusted, hinted at it, the result was not necessarily disillusionment. It was possibility. Perhaps the first expedition had turned back just shy of the crucial fork. Perhaps the second had been misled by enemies of the inland power. Perhaps the city moved, was rebuilt elsewhere after some catastrophe. Perhaps it had been abandoned and would yet be found again, its treasures waiting in silent plazas under the trees. Each disagreement could be made to point, not toward doubt, but toward a new hypothesis, a new route, a new justification for trying once more. The problem of testimony was never only that people lied, though some did. It was that memory, desire, fear, and translation tangled together in every sentence. Men wrote to save face, to secure pensions, to court glory, to protect or condemn others, to make sense of journeys that had often felt senseless while they were underway. Out of this tangle, the image of the lost city never quite resolved into a clear picture. It flickered instead, now lavish and near, now faint and distant, always just beyond the last confirmed fact. And as long as the testimonies failed to agree, there was room, in the gap between them, for another expedition to slip in. By the 18th century, the age of armoured conquistadors and hand-drawn monsters on maps was fading. Something new was arriving in the forest. Glass lenses, brass fittings, finely etched scales, compasses that didn't swing wildly with every bump of the canoe, chronometers that, in theory, could keep perfect time from one hemisphere to another, barometers, thermometers, sextants, the proud vocabulary of the Enlightenment. The jungle was about to meet precision. At least that was the hope from the salons and academies of Europe. On paper the recipe was clear. Send educated men instead of mere adventurers. Equip them with instruments. Let them measure latitudes and longitudes, altitudes and temperatures. Let them write calmly of flora and fauna, of rocks and rivers. In such hands the question of the lost city would shift from rumour to data. Reality was less cooperative. Instruments that performed beautifully on a ship's tidy deck behaved differently under dripping canopies, glass fogged and smeared. Compass needles shivered near iron deposits or under the influence of lightning storms. Chronometers, those fragile hearts of brass and spring, sulked when jolted through rapids or exposed to weeks of damp. A sextant is a marvel when you can see the horizon. In a world where the horizon is a wall of green and cloud, it is mostly a piece of awkwardly shaped metal. So you had a strange new kind of explorer stumbling upriver. He wore, perhaps, the powdered wig and careful manners of a man who had lectured in Paris or Lisbon, who could quote Latin authors and discuss Newtonian gravity. He talked of isotherms and magnetic declination. He filled notebooks with careful tables of sunrise and sunset, angles and bearings, the heights of riverbanks, the positions of stars glimpsed on rare, clear nights. And then, sometimes in the margins of these same notebooks, you find other notes. Indians speak of a great settlement inland. Old man claims with much insistence to have seen a place with streets of stone. Gold ornament observed on child, source unknown. The old rumours had not gone away. They had simply attached themselves to the new apparatus. What changed in this period was not that people stopped dreaming of treasure. It was that treasure and science began to travel under the same flag. A government might fund an expedition partly to refine its maps, to determine where one empire ended and another began. A learned society might sponsor a naturalist to catalogue plants, animals and rocks. But the whisper of a rich interior, a powerful inland polity, a city that might anchor territorial claims, that whisper made purse strings open wider. A voyage promising both knowledge and the possibility of strategic wealth was easier to justify than one promising only abstract enlightenment. This dual purpose did something subtle to the psychology of the search. If you believe you're going purely for gold, then each failure, each empty horizon, weighs heavily. Investors grow impatient. Monarchs find new toys. A string of fruitless journeys can kill a legend. But if you can come back with plant specimens, meteorological readings, observations on the customs of the people along the river, you have not technically failed. You have simply not yet succeeded in the most dramatic part. So you can write, without seeming ridiculous, that you have almost found the city. Near misses multiplied. An expedition reaches a point where the river narrows and the banks grow higher, the water turning muddy with a different kind of soil. The guides say that beyond lie difficult portages and hostile peoples, and the leader, watching his men cough and stumble, decides not to risk it. He turns back, but his instruments have told him something he cannot easily ignore. The river has changed direction. The soil suggests uplands ahead. The birdsong is not quite the same. On the map he draws later, this spot is marked with a small symbol, a note. Region of much promise. Further inquiry required. Another party, decades later, reaches that note and pushes a little beyond. They find not a city, but a cluster of unusually large villages, connected by well-used paths, their leaders wearing ornaments of gold and copper whose origin is unclear. The villagers are wary, and the party, short on supplies, nervous of provoking a conflict, moves on. In the account that returns to Europe, this becomes evidence of an organised polity inland, perhaps dependent on a larger seat of power. The lost city, instead of being disproved, is displaced. It retreats, always one more bend upriver, one more ridge inland. Each new instrument reading, each new measurement, adds a sense of solidity to these almosts. When an explorer says, "We reached 4 degrees south and 60 degrees west, and there observed cultivated fields stretching as far as the eye could see," it feels more concrete than "many days' journey from the coast we saw much cleared land." Even if, in practice, the position is off by dozens of miles, the numbers give an illusion of fixity. And with numbers came a new phenomenon, competing certainties. By the early 19th century, you can find maps and reports that confidently place the lost city, or its conceptual cousins, in different, sometimes incompatible locations. One school of thought anchors it near a certain great bend in the main river, based on an 18th century account cross-checked with newer astronomical readings. Another insists it must lie along a distant tributary, because there, a later expedition found earthworks and mounds that suggested a long-settled landscape. Cartographers, eager not to be left behind by speculation, begin to choose. On one map, in a corner of pale green, you see a tiny mark, "Ancient Ruins, Reported." On another, the same space is labelled "Probable Site of Large Aboriginal City, now destroyed." On a third, that entire region is empty but for the word "unknown." In drawing these symbols and words, map makers are not merely recording information, they are creating fields for the imagination to run in. A merchant in London, tracing a finger along a newly published chart, can see at a glance that there are at least 3 plausible regions where a great city might have stood. A Prussian geographer, reading the proceedings of a scientific society, can point to someone else's coordinates and declare them wrong, proposing his own site on theoretical grounds. Slowly, the lost city ceases to be one fixed place and becomes instead a category, a kind of mirage that can flicker over different patches of green. In this atmosphere, closure becomes difficult. To declare the city non-existent, you would have to inspect every candidate location, test every rumour against the terrain, reconcile every contradictory measurement. No one expedition could hope to do that. What they could do, and what many did, was to disprove one version while leaving all the others intact. You could announce, with some satisfaction, that the lavish realm described by one earlier traveller simply did not exist along the route he claimed. The river he spoke of flowed differently. The distances were exaggerated. The friendly villages he mentioned had no memory of any such power. You could even hint that he had lied. But your own journey might pass through a region where the soil was unexpectedly fertile, where shards of old pottery lay thick underfoot, where earth ridges hinted at forgotten works. You might hear from people whose grandparents had heard it from their grandparents, stories of a time when the riverbanks were more thickly peopled than they are now. Your denial of one legend thus fed another. The city was not there. It might be here, or just over the next divide. Meanwhile, far from the dripping forests, another force was shaping the fever: newsprint. By the middle of the 19th century, literate publics in Europe and the Americas were growing. Newspapers and magazines needed stories, ongoing stories, the kind that could unspool over months and years, drawing readers back for the next instalment. Voyages into blank spaces on the map were perfect for this. An expedition could be serialized. First, the announcement: distinguished naturalist to lead journey into unexplored regions, seeking the source of such and such river, with hopes of resolving the ancient question of a great inland city. Maps would be printed with thick black lines, showing the intended route, the edges of knowledge shaded invitingly vague. Then, letters from the field, brought back by returning messengers or ships, could be excerpted. Our correspondent writes from the interior that the party has encountered many hardships, but has also heard from trustworthy natives of a vast settlement ahead. The hardships made the leader seem brave. The rumour kept the bait in the water. If an expedition vanished, the suspense did not end, it deepened. Weeks stretched into months with no word. Editors speculated. Had the party found something so extraordinary that they had decided to overwinter and continue their work? Had they clashed with hostile tribes? Had they succumbed to fever? Columns filled with reprinted snippets from older accounts, diagrams of the likely terrain, expert opinions on how far a well-provisioned group could travel before running out of supplies. Every uncertainty became a hook. A report that the leader was seen at a river town, gaunt but alive, sparked a fresh wave of excitement, only for the rumour to be contradicted days later. A sketch of a strange artifact carried downriver by traders might be linked, plausibly or not, to descriptions from a decades-old testimony. The city, again, leapt up from the page, half-formed and tantalizing. This media attention did more than satisfy curiosity. It changed incentives. A man who might once have been content to contribute a modest paper to a learned society now knew that his name could be printed weekly in major cities. His hardships followed like the chapters of a novel. Sponsors too saw the publicity value. Funding an expedition was not only a gamble on finding mines or new trade routes. It was a way to keep an empire's name in the public eye, to wrap national prestige around the image of men pushing into the unknown. Under these conditions, to come back and say, "There is nothing there," was almost unspeakable. You could say, "We did not find it." You could point to swamps and thickets and disease as reasons for turning back. You could express doubts about earlier accounts. But to declare the legend finished was to cut off a stream of attention and investment that many people found useful. And so, with each decade, the search became less like a single expedition and more like a serial drama written by many hands. One party's failure was another's prologue. One set of corrected measurements opened a new hypothesis. A rumour dismissed in Lisbon might be revived, slightly altered in New York. The city that had swallowed so many men was fed, in turn, by ink and speculation, each feeding the other in a loop. At some point the logic of the search inverted. Instead of expeditions being mounted because people believed firmly in a specific city at a specific place, expeditions were mounted because the absence of certainty itself had become intolerable. As instruments multiplied and maps grew more crowded with detail, that last patch of ambiguity in the green interior stood out more sharply. Surely, people thought, in an age that could measure the transit of Venus and predict eclipses to the minute, the question of what lay up those rivers could not remain open forever. To close it, more men would have to go farther, stay longer, accept greater risks. The fever was not just greed for gold or hunger for glory anymore. It was the anxiety of an age that had begun to believe that everything eventually must be known. Once you decide that uncertainty itself is the enemy, the shape of an expedition changes. Earlier parties could hug the main rivers, move with the current, and still claim they had done something impressive. They could touch the edge of the unknown, listen to rumours, and turn back when the rains came or the fevers rose. No one, in the 16th century, expected mathematical certainty from a jungle. By the late 19th and early 20th, expectations had shifted. If your sponsors, your public, your own sense of self were all invested in the idea of finally resolving the question, then we went some distance and judged it prudent to return no longer sounded adequate. It sounded like an admission that you had blinked first. So a different logic took hold, the kind that is very easy to understand from a chair at a safe distance, and very hard to resist when you are weeks upriver and everything hurts. You have already come this far, the thinking goes. You have already spent this much. The costs are not just money. They are the men you left sick in a riverside mission, the ones who drowned at the first set of rapids, the animals that died under overloaded packs. They are the letters you wrote before leaving, full of promises about what you would achieve, to turn back before finding something that can be written up as success feels, in that moment, like betraying all of it. Modern psychologists call this sunk cost thinking. It is the bias that makes us double down on bad investments, because abandoning them would make our earlier choices feel wasted. In a boardroom, it can be expensive. In a rainforest, it can be fatal. Imagine a leader standing on a muddy bank where his maps begin to blur into blank paper. Behind him, weeks of hardship, dwindling supplies, a chain of exhausted men. Ahead, a route that his guides say is dangerous, or unknown, or taboo. The rational calculation might say, turn back, regroup, come again better supplied. But the moral weight of what has already been lost leans in the other direction. If we stop here, he thinks, then all of that was for nothing. So he pushes on. There is another force at work, entwined with sunk costs, early success. The first stages of many Amazonian journeys went surprisingly well. On the main trunks of the great rivers, travel could be, if not comfortable, at least manageable. The current did some of the work. Fish were plentiful. Settlements along the banks might offer food, information, even porters. A clever leader with gifts and flattery could turn strangers into allies, obtain guides who knew at least part of the way. This early stretch created confidence. You have navigated one maze of channels already, threaded your way past sandbanks and snags. You have negotiated with chiefs, patched up quarrels in your own camp, treated minor fevers with the little medicine you carry. Each problem solved becomes another piece of evidence that you are equal to this place. Success is seductive. It suggests that more success will follow by the same methods. So when the river narrows and the settlements thin, when the first trusted guide says, "Beyond this I do not go," it is easy to believe that these are just new problems of the same type. If charm and firmness got you this far, perhaps just a bit more charm and a bit more firmness will carry you onward. Leaders began to discount local warnings as overcaution, or superstition, or reluctance to share valuable knowledge. After all, they told themselves, had not earlier guides insisted that some rapid could not be passed, some swamp could not be crossed, and had they not proved them wrong? Each time reality bends a little for you, it becomes harder to imagine a point at which it will refuse. Inside the expedition, meanwhile, the strain accumulates. On paper, a leader is absolute. In practice, a long journey into uninhabited regions is one of the best laboratories for the failure of human discipline. Supplies run low, and rationing begins. Perhaps you had calculated that the distance to the presumed objective was 3 weeks' march. 6 weeks in, you are still walking. The daily portion of food, already meagre, is cut again. Men who are promised adventure and glory find themselves chewing on leather, on bitter roots, on whatever the hunters can bring back. Illness creeps through the camp. First one man with a fever and strange yellow eyes, then another who cannot stop vomiting. The jungle is generous with diseases, malaria, dysentery, infections from the smallest cut. Medicines, carefully weighed and counted back in the city, begin to run out. In this atmosphere, every decision is suspect. When the leader insists, they press on for another 3 days before turning back. Some men nod and tighten their belts. Others think of their blistered feet, their families, the suspicious smell in the water, and decide he has lost touch with reality. A few begin to mutter that he never meant to return at all, that his talk of glory is a mask for madness. Leadership fractures rarely appear as dramatic mutinies. They show up first as hesitation. A man who once leapt to obey an order now moves a little slower. A group sent to scout a route lingers, debates among themselves, comes back with vague answers. Porters slip away at night to follow their own paths home. Local allies, seeing tension in the ranks, decide that this struggling column is no longer a safe bet and drift back toward their own villages. The leader, watching his grip loosen, may respond by softening, compromising, listening. In that case, the expedition sometimes bends with the pressure of reality and returns alive. Or he may harden. The more the world seems to resist his plan, the more he clings to it. Dissent becomes treachery. Suggestions are heard as challenges. Those who voice doubts are punished, or at least shamed, until even valid criticisms go underground. This is another kind of sunk cost. Emotional. To admit that the plan needs to change is to admit that the earlier self, the man who stood up in lecture halls and drawing rooms and said, "Follow me, I know the way," was wrong. Many could not bear that. Common failure points appear again and again in the accounts that come back, or in the gaps where accounts ought to have been. Rations, of course. The jungle looks lush, but much of that green is inedible. Hunting can be good near rivers and clearings, but in dense forest the animals hear you long before you see them. A party that expected to supplement its stores easily can find, too late, that the landscape is stingier than they imagined. Illness. A single sick man can slow the whole column. 2 or 3, and hard choices arise. Leave them in a village that may or may not exist, or delay the march and consume more food. Some leaders pressed on, promising to collect the weak on the way back. Some never did. Distances misjudged. A map drawn from rumour and guesswork marks a plateau, or upland, perhaps 100 miles in. The reality is a labyrinth of ridges and ravines that doubles or triples the effort. Each ridge climbed reveals not a promised vista, but another fold of forested hills stretching away indifferent. Again and again, the problem is not that people lacked courage. It is that they misjudged how courage and planning needed to interact in that environment. The jungle had its own rules. It punished rigidity. A fixed schedule. We will reach this point by this date, then turn north. Made sense in a temperate field campaign where roads and villages could be relied upon. In a rainforest, a single week of heavy rain could swell a modest stream into an impassable barrier, obliterate trails, bring down trees across every path. A plan that could not flex became a trap. It punished arrogance. Assuming that one could always find food from the country, that local people would always be willing to guide or trade, that maps made from afar must be right. These were the assumptions that turned setbacks into disasters. What the forest rewarded quietly and without fanfare was something else: flexibility. Leaders who listened to their guides when they said a certain valley was bad country, who altered their routes to follow animal tracks instead of straight lines, who turned back when the season shifted, were less likely to vanish. Parties that allowed themselves to be taught which plants could be eaten, how to read the water, when to rest instead of forcing the march, left fewer bones along the trails, willingness to abandon the script. Some of the most successful inland travellers were those who arrived with grand designs and, confronted with reality, let those designs go. The lost city might be the official purpose of the mission, the word that unlocked funding and attention, but when faced with impassable swamps or inhospitable uplands, a few quietly chose other goals: mapping a tributary, cataloguing a region's plants, establishing friendly ties with a powerful village. They survived by allowing the myth to recede. Many could not. For them, each setback only proved how close the city must be. Why else, they thought, would the forest fight so hard? Each hardship became a sign that they were on the right track. To turn back just then felt like turning away at the doors of a treasure room, so they went deeper, away from help, away from the routes that could bring them home. There is a moment in many of these stories past which the narrative phrase, "Letters stop arriving. The last reliable sighting is at some river junction or mission station. Later, someone finds an abandoned camp, scraps of equipment, a rusting instrument, a few undecipherable notes in a mildewed journal. Beyond that point, we can only guess. We can say that their logic from the inside probably felt pure. They were finishing what they had begun. They were being true to their promises, to their sponsors, to their own image of themselves. From the outside, with a map and hindsight, we can see that they had passed the invisible line where going farther no longer increased their chances of success, only their chances of disappearing. One man, more than any other, would come to embody this pattern: the early triumphs, the growing certainty, the strained authority, and the final step into a green silence that never fully gave him back. His name was Percy Fawcett, and the city he believed in had acquired a new letter, Zed. Percy Fawcett did not begin as a dreamer. He began as a man who could make lines on paper match the curves of the earth. Born in 1867, educated in the Royal Military Academy at Woolwich, he trained as an artillery officer, the sort of profession that teaches you to care very much about exact distances and angles. Later, he joined the Royal Geographical Society's courses in surveying. That institution was, in many ways, a factory for turning ambitious men into instruments of empire. It taught them to carry a theodolite as if it were a weapon, to look at rivers and ridges and see not just scenery but potential borders. In South America, Fawcett earned a reputation that, by the standards of the time, approached myth. Beginning in 1906, he was sent again and again to the interior to define the vague lines on maps that separated Bolivia from Brazil, Peru from Bolivia, and so on. This was dangerous, unglamorous, and technically difficult work. He had to move through remote, unsettled regions, measure astronomical observations at night, keep delicate instruments intact in hot, wet conditions, and negotiate with local groups whose goodwill could not be taken for granted. He did it with an efficiency that impressed his employers and astonished his peers. Where other parties ran over budget and over schedule, Fawcett finished early. Where others came back with excuses and rough sketches, he produced clear, precise surveys. He had a knack for keeping small, tight expeditions together, for avoiding large-scale bloodshed, for getting through places that had defeated other Europeans. Stories accumulated. The time he refused to fire on an indigenous group that surrounded his camp, choosing instead to sit calmly and play with his dog until curiosity diffused the tension. The way he could march long distances on minimal rations, the apparent immunity he sometimes seemed to display to the fevers that laid others low. On paper, he was exactly the kind of man you might trust to push a little farther than anyone had before, and return to tell you what he had seen. But something else was growing alongside his professional reputation. The more he saw of the interior, the less he was willing to accept the fashionable view in Europe that the Amazon was a green void. incapable of supporting complex societies. He noticed things that did not fit the stereotype: earthworks, mounds, pottery fragments in unlikely places. He read older accounts, including Spanish and Portuguese chronicles that spoke of populous regions and organised towns along certain rivers. Most colleagues dismissed those early descriptions as exaggerations or misunderstandings. Fawcett did not. He began, slowly at first, to assemble a different picture. Part archive work, part field observation, part intuition. He pored over a document sometimes called Manuscript 512, a curious text allegedly written by a Portuguese explorer in the 18th century, describing a ruined city in the Brazilian interior: stone arches, inscriptions, streets. He studied reports of terra preta, the dark, fertile soils that indicated long-term human modification of the forest. He collected indigenous traditions of ancestral places far from the known routes. Out of these fragments, he built an idea he called simply Z. To him, it was not quite the golden city of earlier myths, not El Dorado shimmering with obvious wealth. It was an older, subtler thing, evidence of an advanced pre-Columbian civilization hidden in the high forests or uplands, a place whose discovery would overturn arrogant European assumptions about primitiveness in the tropics. That was the hook for him personally. Fawcett, by temperament, disliked armchair authorities. He believed in things he had touched, measured, walked over. The vision of Z allowed him to imagine one final, conclusive expedition that would prove, with the same precision he had once applied to borderlines, that the forest had harboured something grand. But Z was not just his private fixation. It arrived at a moment when the public wanted exactly that kind of story. The early 20th century in Britain was an era of uneasy transition. The great age of exploration, in which new continents appeared on European maps, was over. The poles had been claimed. The outlines of land masses were well known. Yet the hunger for tales of danger and heroism had not diminished. Newspapers and lecture halls needed new frontiers. The Amazon to urban readers still looked like a blank. Here was a canvas onto which all sorts of fantasies could be projected: lost cities, unknown tribes, relics of vanished ages. Fawcett, with his mixture of hard-earned experience and romantic conviction, was perfectly positioned to supply those fantasies in a way that felt tantalizingly like fact. He lectured, he wrote articles, he hinted more than he asserted. He spoke of Z as probable, not guaranteed, which paradoxically made it feel more real. He described his clues just clearly enough to be plausible, but vaguely enough that the city remained hidden in a haze of possibility. Sponsors were intrigued. So were readers. So were would-be companions. By the time he planned what would be his last major expedition, in 1925, he was not just a surveyor. He was a minor celebrity, the protagonist of his own unfolding legend. The 1925 journey was meant to be lean and efficient, almost austere. He had seen larger expeditions collapse under their own weight, bogged down by animals, supplies, and the logistics of feeding many mouths. This time he chose a tiny party: himself, his 21-year-old son Jack, Jack's friend Raleigh Rimmel, and a handful of Brazilian porters to get them to the real jumping-off point. Their objective region lay in the Mato Grosso, a vast interior plateau west of the town of Cuiabá, in an area along the upper reaches of the Xingu and its tributaries. Fawcett believed, based on his synthesis of documents and conversations, that somewhere beyond the known routes lay the remains of Z. We have their letters from the early stages, from Rio de Janeiro, from São Paulo, from Cuiabá. Fawcett wrote to his wife Nina, and to supporters in England. The tone is confident. Supplies are procured, mules arranged, local authorities placated. In Cuiabá they pause to prepare for the real difficulty ahead. Fawcett sends back instructions that, if the expedition does not return by a certain broad window, no large search parties should be launched. He fears not only for his own safety, but for the lives of those who might try to rescue him in numbers too great to move lightly. Then they leave the last substantial town behind. From that point, the record becomes thinner, but there are still traces. At a place later known as Dead Horse Camp, named for an earlier misfortune of his, Fawcett sends what will be his final known letter, dated late May 1925. In it he notes that the party is in good health, that they are about to enter what he calls unexplored country, and that he expects progress to be slow. He sounds tired but determined. There is no sense of imminent crisis. Local people remember seeing the small column move on from that camp, deeper into the forest and uplands. A few reported the direction of travel. Then, nothing. No more letters, no confirmed sightings, no scraps of equipment that can be securely assigned to them. What happened beyond that point has occupied imaginations for almost a century. The basic possibilities are simple enough. In practice, each branches into a tangle of stories. One possibility is accident. A swollen river during rain could have swept them away. A fall from a cliff, a misstep on a rotten log over a ravine, a canoe overturned in rapids. These are the quiet ways in which the forest ends lives without leaving much trace. In a small party without a large support train, the loss of 1 or 2 men at a critical moment could make further survival nearly impossible. Another is disease. Even an experienced traveller could misjudge his vulnerability. A bout of malaria, a parasitic infection, dysentery from bad water, an infected wound. Anyone could incapacitate a person already worn down by weeks of marching and rationing. A small group nursing one another, with no nearby settlements to fall back on, might simply have succumbed in some patch of forest now indistinguishable from any other. A third is conflict. Rumours began almost immediately after Fawcett's disappearance that he and his companions had been killed by an indigenous group. Over the years, various stories surfaced, that they had been attacked for trespassing in a forbidden area, that a trade gone wrong had escalated, that a perceived insult had turned deadly. Some of these tales pointed to the Kalapalo, a group living in the upper Xingu region. Decades later, anthropologists collected accounts from Kalapalo elders that described 3 white men passing through, ignoring warnings not to continue toward a dangerous area, and later being killed, either by the Kalapalo themselves, angered at the disregard, or by another group farther ahead. Details vary, and time blurs memories, but many researchers today consider some version of this conflict scenario plausible. There is a final, more speculative possibility that captivated certain minds: voluntary disappearance. Fawcett had occasionally expressed disillusionment with aspects of Western society. He entertained, at least in letters, the ideal of a simpler, purer life. He was also, in his later years, drawn to various esoteric and spiritualist ideas, imagining higher planes of existence and hidden masters. This led some to suggest that he might have chosen, if he found a welcoming community, to remain in the forest, living out his days far from the world that had sent him. There is little solid evidence for this. No confirmed reports of a grey-haired Englishman raising a family in some secluded village ever emerged, but the idea refused to die because it aligned with a particular romantic fantasy. The explorer who steps off the map and never comes back, not because he failed, but because he found something better than the people at home could understand. Each explanation says as much about the storyteller as it does about Fawcett. Pragmatic minds favour disease or accident. Those focused on the long, often violent history of contact in the Amazon emphasise conflict. Those attracted to myth prefer the image of the chosen exile. What is certain is simpler. He left the last place we can locate with confidence, walked into an enormous, difficult landscape with a tiny party, and did not return. That absence, that precise empty space where his concluding chapter ought to be, did something powerful to the broader story of the lost city. Before Fawcett, tales of swallowed expeditions had a diffuse quality. A party went in, rumours trickled back, sometimes bones or weapons appeared years later. The legends mixed with older conquest stories and indigenous warnings. Fawcett's disappearance was different because he was, in modern terms, mediated. Newspapers had followed his preparations. Readers had seen his photographs, read his articles, listened to his lectures. They knew his son's name. They had opinions about his methods. When he vanished, it felt to many like watching a public figure step through a doorway that then sealed behind him. Search parties went after him despite his earlier cautions. Some were small, some extravagant. They too suffered hardships and in a few cases deaths. Each failed rescue added another layer, the man who had vanished seeking a city and the men who then vanished seeking him. The pattern inverted itself. Where earlier explorers had used the promise of a city to justify their journeys, people now began using the name of Fawcett to justify their own. Perhaps they thought, he's still alive. Perhaps he left clues. Perhaps by retracing his path we will find not only the city but the legendary man at its heart. The rainforest, indifferent, accepted their footsteps in the same way it had accepted his. Over time the specifics blurred, the exact coordinates of Dead Horse Camp, the different accounts of his last days, the probable fates. What remained, polished by retelling, was the image. Percy Fawcett, seasoned surveyor, hero to many, stepping beyond the last solid line on his map in pursuit of a city he called Z, and never returning to erase or correct that line. From then on, the idea that the interior Amazon was a place that swallowed those who went too far was no longer just an old colonial rumour. It had a modern, named, almost intimate example, and for some that did not serve as a warning. It served as an invitation. If a man like Fawcett could disappear into that green, then surely there must be something there worth disappearing for. Others would follow the trail he'd cut, guided by his notes, his myth, and the same quiet conviction that somewhere beyond the reach of ordinary journeys, the forest was hiding a city that could still be found. In the years immediately after Fawcett's disappearance, the question people asked was simple and practical. What happened to him? It sounded like the kind of question you could answer with boots and determination. Go where he went, ask who he met, follow the river he followed, and the forest would give up its secret. That was the idea behind the first rescue expeditions. They were organised by newspapers, by wealthy backers, by rival explorers who saw a double opportunity: to save a celebrated colleague if he still lived, and to stand in the same aura of mystery if he did not. On paper, these searches had an advantage Fawcett never did. They had hindsight. They knew roughly where he had last been heard from, and they knew he had not returned. They could travel lighter or heavier as they judged best. They could recruit people who had known him, or who had scouted parts of the region. Some carried copies of his correspondence, little annotated maps showing the likely line from Dead Horse Camp into the uplands. They were framed as moral missions. A friend must not be abandoned. A compatriot must be brought home. A famous name must not be left to rot unknown in some nameless clearing. But the Amazon did not care about moral framing. It cared about logistics. And here the rescue efforts ran into a paradox. To look for a small, vanished party in a vast, difficult landscape, you're tempted to be bigger than they were. More men, more supplies, more firepower in case of trouble. You want doctors, interpreters, guides. You want redundancy in case anyone gets sick or dies. You want backup boats, extra animals, a reserve of food for a search that might last months. All of that weight makes you slower. Fawcett's last journey had been planned as a kind of needle. Narrow, swift, able to thread through territories where larger, more obvious expeditions would bog down. The rescue parties that followed were inevitably more like clubs, stronger in some respects, much more vulnerable in others. They drew attention. They needed more from the land and river at every step. Where Fawcett could make amends for a misstep with a small gift and a personal conversation, a column of dozens bearing rifles and baggage animals signalled something different. Secondary searches, in that sense, are often more dangerous than first attempts. The first attempt breaks ground in ignorance. It may be naive, but it is also unencumbered. It is built around one person's judgment, one plan. Follow-up expeditions inherit all the risks of the first journey, plus new ones created by urgency, by publicity, by the pressure to produce an answer. They march under the gaze of newspapers and sponsors. They have less freedom to turn back at the first serious warning. Doing so feels like failing not only yourself, but a missing man whose story you're supposed to complete. Some of the Fawcett rescue expeditions suffered for exactly that reason. They pushed on when they should have paused, because pausing looked, from a London or New York office, like weakness. They changed routes to chase a rumour, because simply retracing his line felt too slow for a world that wanted quick headlines. They quarrelled over leadership and priorities. Men died of fever, of exhaustion, of accidents very like the ones that might have ended Fawcett's life. Some parties staggered back with hollow eyes and no more information than they had started with. Others did not fully come back at all. A few members drifted into the interior, married into communities, or simply vanished from the paper trail, becoming small, human footnotes to a myth that was growing larger than any one person. Each failure had a strange double effect. On the one hand, it made the search for Fawcett look more dangerous, more futile. On the other, it made the story of the lost city more compelling. If you treat the forest as a kind of storyteller, these expeditions were offering it new lines to work with. A leader disappears, then the men sent after him sicken and vanish. Then another group returns with stories of bones that might be his, of villages where his name is half remembered, of warnings carved into trees or whispered by elders who say, "Do not go further, they died there." In reality, many of these reports were fragmentary and contradictory. One party swore it had seen Fawcett's compass hanging from a chieftain's neck. Another claimed to have found his camp, his rifle, his bones. Later examination often showed that such identifications were wishful. Compasses could be traded or looted from any number of travellers. Bones in the forest rarely come with labels. Memories bend to meet the expectations of the listener. If you arrive in a village asking anxiously about a tall, moustached foreigner who vanished years ago, it is easy for people to recall a somewhat similar man who passed through once, or to tell you what they think you need to hear in order to move on. Yet even partial, dubious testimonies had weight. They were repeated in newspapers and books, stripped of their hesitations. Each new rumour became another thread that could be woven into the growing tapestry of Fawcett's legend. Somewhere he had died bravely or foolishly or peacefully among friends. Somewhere his last camp still lingered like a ghost in the trees. Somewhere, maybe, he had found Z and chosen never to return. The specifics changed from teller to teller. The shared core did not. The idea that the interior hid both a man and a city, and that they had in some way merged into the same mystery. As decades passed, a different kind of seeker began to follow Fawcett's route, not in order to rescue him, which by then was clearly impossible, but to rescue the truth from under the pile of stories. Anthropologists, ethnographers, and later archaeologists came, carrying not Winchester rifles and sensational headlines, but notebooks, tape recorders, and survey equipment. They talked to the Kalapalo and neighbouring groups in more systematic ways, documenting not just one dramatic tale, but a whole web of oral histories. They tried to reconstruct, from remembered journeys and landmarks, where 3 foreign men might have walked in 1925 and what might have happened. These later researchers learned several things. One was how easily early testimony had been distorted by translation, by the presence of officials, by fear. A phrase that had once been rendered as "we killed them" sometimes on closer listening carried a more ambiguous meaning. They died here, or they were killed. Responsibility shifted, sequence blurred. In some accounts, Fawcett's party ignored advice not to continue and were killed by another group upriver. In others, they offended local norms and paid the price. In still others, they were simply one more party swallowed by a dangerous landscape. Another lesson was that the very routes Fawcett and his would-be rescuers had taken were not fixed, inviolable lines. Rivers that seem like permanent highways on a map wander in their beds. Trails used heavily in one decade fall out of use in the next, overgrown and forgotten. A path that is the way for one generation of guides may be unknown or disfavoured by their grandchildren. When modern explorers tried to follow the supposed footsteps of 1925, they often discovered that there was no single exact track to be found, only a region, a set of possibilities. And with that realization, the focus of the story began to shift. What had once been a geographical puzzle, where exactly is Fawcett, where exactly is Z, started to look more like a psychological one. Why did so many people keep going back into the same uncertainty? Why did the absence of clear answers make the place seem more, rather than less, alluring? The answer has something to do with the way humans respond to unresolved stories. A mystery without a body, without a confirmed site, stays open in the mind. It invites projection. Fawcett's disappearance became a mirror for different kinds of longing, for adventure, for escape, for vindication. Each new expedition presented itself as an attempt to close the book, to draw a neat line under the last chapter. Each, by failing to do so, added another unwritten page. The lost city itself followed a similar path. Early chroniclers had placed El Dorado, Manoa, the inland empire in different corners of the map. Fawcett's Z had been another such fixation, more grounded in documents but still speculative. After him, the exact location mattered less than the idea that there was something in the forest capable of turning rational men into pilgrims. As archaeologists uncovered more about real pre-Columbian settlements in the Amazon, earthworks, causeways, patches of terra preta, they gradually replaced fantasy with evidence. But the emotional shape of the legend did not disappear. It simply migrated. By the late 20th century, when people spoke of following Fawcett, they were often frank that they did not expect to find his bones or his city in any literal way. What they were seeking was harder to name. The edge, the feeling of walking off the map as he had done. Z, in that sense, became less a point on the earth and more a point in the human mind where curiosity and risk intersect. The forest, for them, was not only a tangle of vines and rivers. It was a test of how far a person would go in pursuit of something that might not exist except as an organizing dream. In that way, the story of those who went looking for the lost slowly turned itself inside out. The jungle remained, the rivers rose and fell, the villages shifted and endured. What changed was the axis of the tale. It stopped being mainly about a hidden city in the trees and began to be about the people who could not stop walking toward it, even when all the practical reasons to do so had been exhausted. Geography faded into background, obsession moved to the centre, and in the quiet hours when you imagine their lanterns dwindling among the trunks, what lingers is not the outline of stone walls no one has yet proven, but the image of small human figures still pressing forward into darkness, convinced that just beyond the next bend the answer to all of it is waiting. If you pause the story right here, with Fawcett vanishing into uncertainty and later expeditions trying to untangle rumour from memory, the lost city still feels like a kind of mirage, an idea superimposed on a green blur. Either there is a great stone city in the forest or there isn't. Either he was right or he was deluded. But that's not quite how the picture looks anymore. In the last few decades, archaeology has been quietly redrawing the mental map that men like Fawcett carried in their heads. The forest that once appeared to outsiders as a pure wilderness, untouched and untouchable, has begun to look more like something else, a palimpsest, a surface written on, erased, and written over again so many times that you only see the earlier texts if you know exactly how to look. Early chroniclers had already hinted at this. They talked about wide roads, raised fields, towns along the rivers that could muster thousands of warriors. For a long time, those reports were mostly treated as exaggeration, or as misunderstandings of what Europeans thought a city should look like. When 19th and early 20th century explorers didn't find stone walls and pyramids in the central Amazon, many concluded there had never been large, complex societies there at all. The forest, they said, was too poor, the soil too thin, the environment too fragile to support dense populations. It was a neat conclusion. It matched the empty spaces on colonial maps. It made the failure to find Manoa, El Dorado Z feel inevitable. You can't discover what never existed. Then the ground started to argue back. In the upper Singu, not too far from where Fawcett disappeared, archaeologists began to notice patterns that didn't look like randomness. Shallow ditches forming circles and rectangles, low earthen embankments, patches of forest with an odd abundance of certain useful trees, fruit, nut and timber species, clustered together in ways that didn't make ecological sense if they'd simply grown there by chance. Under the leaf litter, shards of pottery, fragments of burned clay from what had once been house posts, traces of dark, unusually fertile soil. Piece by piece, a different picture emerged. The central and southern Amazon, far from being an unpeopled jungle, had once been home to networks of large villages and towns. Not one single capital gleaming in stone, but clusters of settlements linked by roads and waterways, stitched together by trade, alliance, and ritual. In some regions, these took the form of what we now call geoglyphs, vast earthworks carved into the ground, circles, squares, interlocking shapes, some hundreds of meters across. Viewed from above, they look like gigantic symbols cut through the forest. On the ground, especially after centuries of regrowth, they could easily be missed as just another set of undulations in the red earth. In other areas, especially around the upper Singu, researchers found evidence of planned towns. Not simply a scattering of houses, but ring-shaped villages with central plazas, arranged along straight roads connecting them to neighbouring settlements. Defensive ditches encircled some of these places. Beyond them, there were causeways, bridges, and miles of what appear to be artificially raised fields and managed wetlands. This is not the footprint of a few small bands of foragers drifting through a pristine forest. It is the infrastructure of landscape-scale planning. One of the most striking clues lies in the soil itself. Much of the Amazon basin is covered by highly leached, nutrient-poor earth. Yet scattered throughout are patches of something very different. Terra preta, literally dark earth. These black carbon-rich soils are full of pottery fragments, animal bones, and microscopic charcoal. They hold nutrients far better than the surrounding dirt. They seem to regenerate over time. The simplest explanation is also the most revolutionary. These soils are human-made, the cumulative result of people carefully managing waste, ash, organic matter, and perhaps even intentionally composting their living spaces over centuries. Terra preta is not an accident. It is a technology, a way of turning an apparently hostile environment into one that can support gardens, orchards, and dense communities for generation after generation. Now pair that with the tree patterns. In many parts of the basin, the forest is not a random mix of species, but is skewed toward plants that are useful to people. Brazil nuts, cacao, certain palms, arranged in invisible orchards that radiate out from old settlement sites. What looks like wild jungle may actually be a kind of abandoned food system, still quietly feeding animals and people centuries after its planners fell ill, were displaced, or died. The term archaeologists often use for this is anthropogenic landscape, a landscape shaped, maintained, and in some cases created by human activity. Not a neat divide between city and wilderness, but a gradient. Plazas and houses in the centre, gardens and fields around them, then zones of managed forest, and beyond that, hunting territories threaded by rivers that double as highways. If you walk into such a world expecting stone towers, you will be disappointed. If your definition of a city requires masonry that can defy weather for 1,000 years, you will think you have found nothing. But if the city's houses are built from wood, its public spaces bounded by earthworks, its monuments made of living trees and dark soil, time will treat it very differently. Timber rots, thatch collapses, polished plazas become clearings, then thickets, then full-grown forest. Defensive ditches fill in, one wet season at a time. Embankments soften and sprout ferns. After a few hundred years, what remains is subtle. A slightly raised mound, a change in soil colour when you scrape away the top layer, a line of unusually old trees marking a former road. Men like Fawcett could have walked right over such traces without realising it. A village that had stood a few hundred years earlier would leave almost no obvious sign to a traveller primed to look for stone. Part of the reason we can see these things more clearly now is that we have learned to look from a different vantage point. In the early 21st century, archaeologists began using LIDAR, light detection and ranging, in Amazonian surveys. From an aircraft, a LIDAR system sends out thousands of laser pulses per second and measures how long they take to bounce back. Most of those pulses hit leaves and branches, but a fraction slip through gaps in the canopy and hit the ground. Software can filter out the vegetation and reconstruct the underlying terrain in astonishing detail. When those digital forests are peeled back, a ghostly geometry appears. Straight lines where natural rivers prefer to meander, grids where random topography would be expected, rings, causeways, platforms, sometimes covering tens or hundreds of square kilometers. Suddenly, the supposed emptiness of parts of the Amazon doesn't look so empty. It looks abandoned. This does not mean the legends map neatly onto any single site. No one has flown a LiDAR survey over the upper Xingu, circled a collection of earthworks and said, "There it is, Z, just as Fawcett imagined." In fact, in some ways the new evidence makes that kind of single-point revelation less likely. Instead of one great urban jewel, archaeologists keep finding constellations, dispersed, interconnected townships, ceremonial centres linked to smaller villages, regions where human influence shaped forest composition at a continental scale. Complexity, but not necessarily in the form that European imaginations had trained themselves to recognize. The inland empires and shining cities described in early chronicles might be remembered versions of these networks, exaggerated through distance and desire. A traveller raised among small fortified villages along a cold European river might well describe a region of plaza-centred towns, fed by orchards and raised fields, as an empire. A chain of settlements stretching along hundreds of kilometres of navigable water could feel like a continuous city. In the telling, the spaces in between shrink. The lights become one blaze. Fawcett's Z was shaped by that inheritance. He went looking for stone because stone is what had survived in the Old World. The Roman Forum, the Inca walls, the Maya pyramids. He read his 17th century sources through a 19th century lens and pictured a compact metropolis, secreted away behind some last line of hills. What archaeology now suggests is more diffuse and, in its own way, more impressive. There almost certainly were large, sedentary, socially complex societies in and around the regions he traversed. They engineered the land, built earthworks, enriched the soil, planted living architectures of useful trees. They rose, flourished, and in many cases collapsed or transformed under the combined pressures of climate shifts, internal dynamics, and later, disease and violence brought from outside. By the time Fawcett passed through, centuries of epidemics had scoured many riverine populations. Villages had moved, merged, or dwindled. Knowledge had been lost. What remained were fragments. An old ditch here, an anomalous clearing there, a rumour of a people once more numerous, a story of ancestors who lived in big places where the forest is now thick. When you line those fragments up next to the geoglyphs seen in satellite images, the terra preta pits dug by archaeologists, the LiDAR maps that suddenly reveal gridded roads under seemingly untouched canopy, the legend begins to sound less like pure invention. It feels more like an echo, a memory distorted by time and translation, anchored not in a single plan-drawn city, but in a whole class of places that no longer look the way they once did. So when we ask, today, whether the lost city existed, the most honest answer is both narrower and broader than Fawcett might have liked. There may never have been one Manoa, one Zed, waiting like a prize at the end of the right river. But there were cities of another kind, earth and wood, soil and water, woven into the forest, and their traces are still there for those who know how to find them. That difference matters if you are making maps. It matters less if you're lying awake, imagining lantern light under the trees. The archaeology bends the legend toward reality, but it doesn't quite erase the mystery. It tells us that human beings really did once build great, intricate worlds in the green depths, and that those worlds could vanish so completely that even a determined seeker would walk through their shadows and never see the outline, which leaves us with a quieter, more unsettling thought. If whole landscapes of cities can disappear so thoroughly that they become myths, what exactly are we standing on now? and how many of the stories we tell about empty places are only gaps in our own way of looking. Part of the answer lies in that last question. Empty places, or what we tell ourselves are empty places, have always exerted a particular pull on the human mind. On an old map, it's the uncoloured patch that draws the eye more insistently than the carefully labelled coasts. On a satellite image, it's the dark mass of unbroken canopy between the rivers of light. We are strangely compelled by what we can't quite see. The legends of Manoa and Z grew in exactly that kind of space. Beyond the mission towns, beyond the known river bends, there was a zone of uncertainty where hearsay could stretch without immediately snapping against a checked fact. A trader swore he had seen a plaza. A captive remembered a raised road. A missionary's second-hand account mentioned great settlements, whose people had since died of sickness. All of it floated on top of an area no European had yet drawn in with confidence. The result was a hybrid, part report, part projection, part wish. Our brains are not comfortable with blankness. When information runs out, imagination quietly volunteers to fill in the remainder. We do it with partial photographs, with half-overheard conversations, with childhood memories that lose their edges. We did it, collectively, with the Amazon. Faced with a tangle of unvisited rivers and contradictory testimonies, many early readers chose a kind of maximal answer. If the forest hid anything, why not a city large enough to reorder wealth and power? Why not an inland empire? The more those spaces shrank under exploration, the more intense the remaining mystery became. By Fawcett's time, the blank areas on maps had retreated far inland, but they hadn't entirely vanished. What remained were pockets, constricted uncertainty, like a story with most of its scenes told but one crucial chapter missing. That missing chapter takes on disproportionate weight. Your attention keeps circling back to it. That is part of why Fawcett's disappearance is so oddly satisfying, narratively speaking, even as it was catastrophic in reality. The man who devoted his life to entering the blank space literally vanishes into it. No confirmed grave, no returned notebook, no final survey point marked with an X. His story ends where the map does. Swallowed is the word people reach for. The forest swallowed him. The river swallowed the expedition. The lost city swallowed every explorer who searched for it. It's an image, but beneath the metaphor there is a very literal truth about how quickly tropical nature can erase the sharp lines we try to draw on it. In many temperate landscapes, ruins linger as skeletons. Stone walls stand half-tumbled for centuries. Roads remain as clear ridges. You can walk past a medieval village site in a European field and still see the outlines of house platforms long after the last thatch turned to dust. In the Amazon, the timescales compress. Wood succumbs to insect and fungi. Thatch collapses under the weight of a single wet season. What fire doesn't take, humidity softens, digests, folds back into soil. A trail hacked with great effort can vanish into regrowth in a matter of weeks. A clearing becomes saplings in a season, young forest in a decade, canopy in what, by archaeological standards, amounts to a blink. For the people living there, this impermanence is simply how the world works. Houses are rebuilt, gardens are shifted, paths straighten around new obstacles. Continuity lives in stories, in kinship, in knowledge of which tree was planted by which grandparent, rather than in unchanging stone. To someone coming from a world where old things stay visibly old, that rapid softening reads differently. It feels active. It feels like the forest is not just allowing structures to decay, but actively repossessing them, covering the traces, taking back the space. Hence the language of swallowing, of devouring, of a green sea rolling in over whatever came before. That same dynamic is what allowed whole urbanized landscapes to become almost invisible from ground level. It also powers the legend's staying power. When you hear that nothing remains of a once great city, your mind performs a small trick. Nothing visible is converted into something hidden. Absence becomes concealment. The more complete the erasure, the more thorough the presumed secret. There is romance in that, and it can be a dangerous romance. The history of the search for El Dorado and Z is full of people who valued the thrill of chasing a phantom more than they valued the lives and knowledge of the people they met along the way. Indigenous guides were used and discarded. Local warnings were ignored. Rivers of rumour were treated as if they somehow mattered more than the very real villages on their banks. If we want to keep the wonder and lose the harm, we have to separate those layers. One is the lure of the unknown itself, the human fondness for unfinished stories, for questions that don't close neatly. That part is, in some sense, harmless. It's the same impulse that keeps us turning pages in a book long after midnight, or scrolling through old shipwreck maps, or listening to speculative documentaries until the sleep blurs the edges between fact and possibility. The other layer is the idea that the unknown exists primarily for us to conquer, to own, or to convert into profit. That belief is what drove men into the interior with chains, guns, and flags, long before they came with notebooks and compasses. It's what made some of them treat the forest as a stage set, peopled with obstacles and informants rather than with societies as complex and self-authored as their own. Archaeology has quietly undermined that second layer. The more we learn about pre-contact Amazonian societies, their engineering, their cosmologies, their long relationships with particular stretches of river, the less convincing the old story of empty wilderness awaiting discovery becomes. The blank space on the map is no longer just an invitation, it's also an omission, a record of what the mapmaker did not yet know or did not bother to ask. And yet the first layer, the gentler wonder, persists. It becomes easier to direct it differently. Instead of imagining a single golden city untouched under the vines, we can imagine 1,000 overlapping pasts under our feet. Instead of picturing Fawcett stepping into a pristine domain of nature, we can picture him walking, unknowingly, through the outskirts of a landscape that had already been thought about, planned, modified, for centuries. Some questions remain open, and they are worth holding on to not because answers will necessarily be spectacular, but because the act of asking reshapes how we see the world. How many earthwork networks are still mapped only by the roots of long-lived trees? How many stretches of primary forest still carry the fingerprints of old orchards, their pattern legible only to those who know precisely which species to count and where? How did different riverine societies conceive of their territories? As scattered villages, as linear cities threaded along water, as sacred geographies tied to mythic journeys? Even at the scale of Fawcett's small party, mysteries linger. Exactly which community did they encounter last? What stories do the descendants of those people tell about the strangers who walked off into the forest and were never seen again? In some oral histories, the lost explorers are barely a footnote. In others, they return as cautionary figures, examples of men who went too far or refused to listen, or crossed a boundary marked in ways they could not read. Those are questions that can still be asked, carefully, with respect, with the understanding that not all answers are ours to claim. Some knowledge is meant to stay local, to circulate within the descendants of those who made the dark earth and planted the orchards and built the ringed villages. What we are allowed to keep, from a distance, is the quieter realization that the world is always thicker than our explanations. Beneath any simple statement about what a place is, a jungle, a void, a treasure house, there are older layers, different uses, forgotten names. In that sense, the lost city has already done its work. Whether or not there ever was a single Manoa that matched the most extravagant chronicles, the idea of such a place forced generations of outsiders to confront the possibility that the green expanse they saw as empty might in fact be full of histories as intricate as any marble capital, full of choices about how to live with water, soil, and time. As you lie here, following this story towards sleep, the idea can settle into something softer. You don't need to decide tonight exactly how many plazas lay along that river, or whether Fawcett's Z corresponded to any one cluster of earthworks. You can simply let the possibility hover that somewhere, under the layers of leaves and years and roots, There were once places where evening fires ringed a central square, where children learned paths by heart, where songs rose up into the same darkness that now hangs above you. The romance is still there, but it no longer needs gold to shine. It lives in the thought that we move across surfaces we barely understand, that the solid ground beneath our feet, any ground anywhere, might be resting on someone else's vanished map. The lost city calls to us in the end, not because it promises riches or glory, but because it reminds us how much we do not see. It invites us to imagine depth where our eyes report only a smooth green wall. It suggests that even when the last stone has crumbled and the last trail is closed, something of a place persists, in soils, in tree patterns, in stories, and in the lingering questions that drift through our minds as the waking world fades. You don't have to solve those questions. You can let them remain, gently unresolved, like distant lights on a river you will never quite reach. By now, you've drifted with this story from the first faint rumours all the way to satellite images and soil chemistry. You've watched a city begin as a whisper on a colonial dockside, harden into ink on maps that lied as much as they informed, and then pull real people, in real canoes and boots, deeper and deeper into a landscape that did not care what they were looking for. You followed chroniclers who wrote of gilded kings and shining plazas. You've seen those words picked up by cartographers who, faced with a blank interior, chose to draw certainty where there was only suggestion. You've walked beside Raleigh, polishing his tale of Manoa into something fit for a queen, and beside Fawcett, marching toward his letter Z as if a single mark on paper could compel the world to rearrange itself around him. Then the view shifted. The heroic parties with banners and mules gave way to quieter expeditions with trowels and notebooks. Planes replaced caravels. Lidar beams slipped through leaves where once only arrows had flown. The jungle that seemed to erase every trace began, bit by bit, to give up a different kind of record. Rings of raised earth, darkened soils, lines that straighten when you look at them from far, far above. Taken together, those layers do not resolve neatly into the kind of city the 16th century imagination wanted. There is no confirmed golden capital, no single imperial square waiting exactly where an old map promised it would be. What there is instead is something both less theatrical and in its way more astonishing. Evidence that much of what was dismissed as untouched wilderness had been lived in, modified, thought about for centuries before the first rumours of El Dorado flickered into letters. The strongest threads we can follow now point not to a lone metropolis, but to networks. Chains of earthwork towns along rivers, gridded causeways, patchworks of orchards and gardens layered into what later visitors misnamed virgin forest. In those patterns, the inland empire of the old story starts to look less like pure invention and more like a distortion, a funhouse reflection of real complexity glimpsed at an angle through translation, illness, and wishful thinking. And yet, even here, in the age of spectral images and gene sequences, pieces do not quite lock together. We still don't know exactly how many people lived in those river basins at their peak, or how far certain cultural traditions spread. We can't say with confidence whether any one cluster of plazas ever matched the scale of Raleigh's Manoa, or whether Fawcett's Z corresponded to an actual remembered landscape, or to a collage of reports that never truly belonged to the same place. Some of the most tantalizing questions sit just outside the reach of excavation. They live in stories that have not been written down, in names for rivers and knolls that carry meanings only fully understood by the communities that still use them. They live in the choices not to tell certain things to outsiders. That too is part of the mystery, and it deserves to be left intact. So, at the end of this long, slow curve through rumour and river and return, you're allowed to do something simple. Stop. Let the lost city remain slightly out of focus. Let the city that supposedly swallowed every explorer keep, for itself, whatever it has decided not to show as yet. You can hold both truths at once, that there were real, intricate societies in those forests, whose traces we are only beginning to recognize, and that the exact shapes of their cities, their ceremonies, their stories at dusk, may never be fully mapped in a way that satisfies a curious outsider lying awake many centuries later. As you rest here, you can treat that gap not as a problem to be fixed, but as a kind of gentle space in the mind, a place where possibilities can breathe. Maybe that's why stories like this work so well as you drift towards sleep. They offer just enough structure to follow, and just enough uncertainty to soften at the edges and merge with whatever dreams your own brain is ready to stage. If you'd like to keep wandering through histories like this as you fall asleep, half fact, half open question, it does help in the very practical sense to let the channel know. You can tap like, or subscribe, or let an algorithm somewhere know that slow stories about distant times are something you'd like more of. You can also add your own small mark to the map of listeners by leaving a comment and saying where you're listening from. A city balcony, a dorm room, a quiet farmhouse, a night shift break room. It's strangely grounding to remember that these tales about vanished places are heard in so many different present ones. And if your mind is still turning, just a little, around the idea that all of us are the heirs of much older bottlenecks and branchings, there is another path you can take when this audio ends. I've put together a book about prehistoric secrets, about how near extinctions and hidden turning points shaped the ancestors of everyone alive today. It's told in the same slow, story-driven way, meant to be read or listened to as you fall asleep. You can find it at sleepytimehistory.com. For now, though, you don't have to click anything, or decide anything. You can let the explorers fade back into the green, let the maps curl at the edges, let the gold dust settle into ordinary soil. Somewhere, far away, rain is still falling on river water that once reflected the fires of those vanished plazas, if they were there. You can let that picture stay hazy and kind. Let the mystery of the lost city linger just at the edge of thought, like a dim light behind trees as your own night deepens and finally closes over the day.